All right, so we are going to get started. Welcome to the January 7th, 2020 meeting of the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan. We're going to jump right in as quick as we can. My name is Rachel Tanner. I am the Assistant Director of the Planning Development Services Department, joined here tonight by Della Costa and Alan Calder, and Chitra, who's also here at the City of Palo Alto. And Della and Alan are contractors, consultants from Rincon Consultants. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. We also have a meeting this month on January 21st, so you get to see us twice in January, kicking off your new decade right, with a lot of public service. So we thank you for that. So we'll be back here in this room 5:30 on Tuesday, January 21st for a working group meeting where we'll discuss the 3 draft plan alternatives. We'll be building on what we did last month in December, adding some density, conversation, height, form, and also revisiting the other topics that we talked about that evening, which were circulation, district character, open space, housing, and housing types. We're also going to be presenting, Chitra and myself, on January 28th, the Parks and Rec Commission at 7 p.m. in the council chambers. And so you'll remember we want to make sure that they are both knowing about our creek study and understanding that, but also the great connection between the expansion of the park being just across the way from the project site. I know last time we met, I think we were coming just off of the council decision to kind of keep our project budget the same and not to fund additional services. We've been working with Perkins and Will. I think we've come up with some great solutions to trim the budget and still keep in the analyses that we had wanted. Not all of the analyses, but we will have analyses so we can compare the 3 alternatives to each other with more than just our thoughts, but with some data to back it up. So we're excited about that. I know we will be happy to have that. So we're not everything, but we're keeping a core of that, so that's really good. So tonight we're going to start out with public comment. We have, how many speakers do we have? 2 speakers, and if speakers, you can keep your comments to 3 minutes. There is a podium and a microphone over here to my right and to your left. And call the first speaker, please, Chitra.
David Hirsch.
Okay. Greetings all. First, I want to announce that Alex is here for the ARB. Although I'm a member of the ARB, Alex has been finally representing us here for all of your meetings. I know I've sat in on a few of them. So I'm not speaking as an ARB, but rather as an individual here who's rather interested in Ventura area and has been for quite a while. I've distributed some design concepts that I hope you would read. I wish you actually had sort of read them before I got up here. So if I could give you just a few minutes to read and take that off my 3 minutes, please.
We have a pretty packed agenda, so you'll have to use your 3 minutes, and then people will have to read at their leisure. Thank you, though.
Okay. So my question to you is, how do a diverse community, a group determined to a planning scheme for an 11-acre site near a downtown, adjacent to a major thoroughfare, within a community of mixed housing and commercial offices, next to a low-scaled, mostly single-family neighborhood? How do you start? You start with an a priori concept, or do you have a series of observation and share these experiences? Or do you combine these 2 opposites? I think you do both simultaneously. And for this, you have to have practical advisors and dreamers. From the early visits to Ventura by bike 3 years ago, I observed the many other bikes on Park Boulevard, recognized how Boulevard Park was an underutilized and inadequate playground for the community, understood that this large parcel was unique by its very size, recognized that there was a possibility for something special to happen here. What could this develop to, could this do to link you to California Avenue, to the Caltrain station? How could this become a unique place with its own identity? How could this happen if Fry's remained in its entirety as a major obstruction? it became obvious to me that the high-quality landscape bike and pedestrian greenway could connect Park Boulevard through the site to Bulware Park and beyond to Ventura and the communities of Barron Park and to Mountain View. With this unique opportunity, it would be like a junior version of the High Line in New York, but singularly to Palo Alto, a ground-level experience. One of the prime elements, Bulware Park, just came together after the city bought the AT&T parcel. City's landscape designer showed his preliminary concepts to some from the community, asked for their input, and stated that he hoped to eliminate Ash Street in the park area there and unify the new design with an attractive, totally renovated park. And adding to this, you and the planners have concluded that it's possible to significantly reduce the size of Fry's structure and adapt its reuse to a program that could become a focal point for this new development. So this is the dream of a greenway could be a reality, with the buildings defining the perimeter, establishing a new open and welcoming invitation to the neighborhood, and sharing the park and creating a new pathway to downtown. Of course, there are many unresolved issues, but one in particular stands out. As you see on the green area of the sketch that I submitted, it's a very large building as I describe it, but it's in fact way out of scale. So rethinking that idea, it seemed to me that you could do something a lot less massive and...
Sorry, sir, that's your time. Thank you so much.
One more minute?
We've got four other speakers. We have three other speakers, so four total that actually have their time waiting as well. So I want to thank you for bringing this forward. And
let me just finish this up.
Sir, I'm sorry. We have to give everybody equal time, and we've already given you more than 3 minutes. So if you can please conclude your comments. Thank you so much.
Next speaker, Todd Collins.
Todd Collins. I'm the president of the Palo Alto School Board, but I'm here representing myself. I'm delighted to hear that you're able to bring in all your analyses for the same reduced budget. If we can have you come over and work on the school side immediately, that would be awesome. I'm going to tell Superintendent Austin right away and get your name. Finally, I wanted to point, I reviewed the materials for tonight's meeting, and I wanted to point out that any consideration of local schools is still missing from both the draft plan alternatives from December and the Planning 101 overview. In fact, the word school does not even appear in either document, at least per my PDF search of both documents. So there's no reference to schools or school planning in any of these planning documents or draft proposals at all. I continue to believe that neighborhood schools are one of the chief public resources of any residential community, and that's even more true of Palo Alto. Access to schools is one of the most important drivers of whether a community will attract families or not, and attracting families has been one of the hallmarks of Palo Alto for its entire existence. In our increasingly crowded and built-out town, with land as expensive as almost anywhere in the world, if we don't plan for neighborhood schools when we redesign or build neighborhoods, there won't be any. There just won't be any. We see this with Stanford, we see it in the research part, we see it at outer San Antonio, and we see it here. And without schools, there will be fewer families. We're already seeing significant region-wide decline in the number of families and young children, and Palo Alto is no different. I wrote an op-ed piece about this a couple months ago. I brought a few copies. You're welcome to look at it if you have interest. So while we should welcome all residents, when we talk about our community's character and what we want to preserve, which is what I think this committee is designed to do, almost everyone values a community where families and children play a central role. And if our focus shifts from walk to school to walk to coffee, or walk to restaurants, or walk to transit, and from having pleasant parks to having vibrant streetscapes, which I could understand what some people might prefer, but that hasn't been what we've done in Palo Alto, we will have a different community than what we have been and what many of us would want us to be. So I continue to urge you to make neighborhood schools a key planning priority in your process. And please bring school planning into these documents, because if you don't plan for schools, for neighborhood schools, there will not be any. Thank you.
Next
Please call the
speaker-
next speaker.
Next speaker, Karen Holman.
If you don't mind, just pass those. If people are interested, they can just.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Karen Holman.
Hi, good evening. Happy New Year to everybody. Sorry I had to miss last meeting. I had family in town and just couldn't get here.
Sorry, that was it.
The new regime. It's a little scary on the parking downstairs. I heard the breaking news about Iran, and it's pretty darn scary out there. So anyway, there's some ballistic missiles have been launched in Iran against. Anyway, it's pretty scary out there. So anyway, that's all the more reason why we should all be respectful of each other and work towards a common goal here to show that there can be unity in communities. What I'm hopeful for and haven't yet seen in this planning process is placemaking. It's a basic planning principle, and we have various elements in this area that are ripe for the basis for placemaking. The cannery building, the creek, what an opportunity that we have here. Some other buildings, there's the iconic designs that we have there. I shouldn't call them iconic at this point, but there's a general industrial pattern in the building of architecture. There's a lot to build on there, and I just don't see that happening in this process. I remind us to go back and look at the goals for this plan, and some of them were to build on existing character. One of them was, to not have increased traffic, that sort of thing. I wasn't here for the last meeting, but I did look at the plans online prior to that meeting, and what I saw was straight streets and some one-way streets. The fastest inducers to speeding up traffic are straight streets and one-way streets. They induce speeding traffic. And living on a one-way street, I can tell you it's absolutely true, and we could go on and on about that. Also, something else that I've noticed that is really, truly missing in the discussion here is arts and culture and economic development. It's not a new planning principle. It's been in place and been utilized many, many places over some decades, a recognition that arts and culture, which this group has spoken about and been encouraging of, are inducements to economic vitality. I haven't seen that referenced. It works, and it could work here, especially with the cannery building and a creek nearby. Economics are not and should not be based on square footage of development, how many units, the rates for office rent, although those should surely be elements to consider. So I'm not saying that we should look at these things in isolation of each other, but in partnership with each other. There are options that need to be looked at, not options, but they are integrated elements that should be considered. One quote from one plan area that was done. It's an art-based economic development project. One sentence. The best of the projects nurture distinctive qualities and resources that already exist in the community. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
I don't have any more speaker cards.
No more speaker cards? Okay, great. Thank you all for who are here and who gave public comment, and we hope we will stay engaged, whether it's tonight or in future meetings. So with that, I want to introduce what we'll be doing this evening. The goal tonight is to develop a better understanding and provide an interactive discussion on the principles of planning great places and how we can do so in Palo Alto. For some folks who've been involved in planning, I'm thinking of Doria, Alex, who've been involved in work for a long time, who are professionals in this, Tim, this may be things that you've already talked about or learned about or use in your work, but we want to provide an opportunity, as we heard from many members who wanted to kind of have this general discussion. And so we had a lot of information in the printed report. Hopefully it was an invitation to explore for you topics that you're interested in. Please, you don't have to try to read everything that's there and all the attachments, but hopefully something that could help. And so tonight we are going to have myself, Della, and Alan who will be presenting. And we also have a guest speaker, Diane Whitmar. Am I saying it right? Whitmar? Dittmar. I put a W in your name. I don't know why. From Palo Alto Housing, who will be here to talk with us, and so we can have a discussion with her. So we are going to aim to be expeditious, but not hurrying. And so there may be times where we have slides that we will say, you know what, we're going to just have the slide here. We'll send it to you, have the information, but we may not cover it orally in order to save time. I want to introduce Alan and Della. They have been with us for a couple meetings, but kind of in the background. Given the departure of Elena, we needed to bring on some extra support to help kind of more on the city side, in addition to what Perkins and Will are doing in terms of actually doing a lot of the planning and analysis. They're kind of helping us to make sure we keep chugging behind the scenes. Alan is a supervising planner with Rincon Consultants, and he has 29 years of experience in both national and international land use and municipal planning. He serves as the manager for the Northern California Contract Planning Service line with Rincon, and he's done everything from long-range projects to current planning, again, internationally and domestically. And then Della Costa here is a long-range planner from Rincon Consultants with expertise in comprehensive and technical plans. So she's done a lot of work with communities like Palo Alto, updating their various plans, whether it's in sustainability, in their general plans, and other plans like that involve a lot of analysis and community engagement. So we're very lucky to have both of them with us here tonight. Thank you both for being here. So with that, we're going to jump into our first topic, which is the general planning principles. So I'm going to hand it over to Della.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'll just let you know when we need to change slides. Yeah, I guess. Okay.
You can try this clicker. It should advance for you.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, like Rachel said, for some of you, this may be things that you already know, but we want to make sure that we're laying the groundwork for everyone. We're all starting from the same place. So, for those of you that already know this, maybe it'll spur thoughts or questions that you hadn't thought of. And for the rest of you, of course, hopefully you'll learn something. So long-range planning, we're going to be talking about how planning becomes placemaking. And the planning framework, there's sort of a hierarchy to it. So we start with the general plan, which in Palo Alto and the rest of the country is called the comprehensive plan. It's the same thing, general plan, comprehensive plan. And then the comprehensive plan sets the vision for the community, what the community wants to be over the next years, decades, into the future. From there, we zoom in to land use plans. That's your specific area plans. And there's also operational plans, which zoom into certain topics like master plans, park plans, utility plans. And then we go down into the municipal code, which includes the zoning ordinance, and that is where rubber meets the road. That is how you implement the vision of the general plan. So it's the nitty-gritty. What exactly is that use? How is it going to look on the ground in order to accomplish the vision of the general plan? Comprehensive plans are required by California law. Every city and county in the state has to have one. And they are considered the blueprint for development. They dictate where and how development is laid out across the jurisdiction. And they are intended, comprehensive plans and area plans and the zoning ordinance are intended to be living documents. They are not static. They are amended and changed and adapted over the years to accommodate changing conditions and new legislation that comes down the pipe. Comprehensive plans are the vision for the community. So this is just a snapshot of what the vision is for Palo Alto, what the goals are listed in the comprehensive plan for Palo Alto, and what the city is trying to accomplish when they make development decisions. So the NVCAP goals, any other area plan goals, the zoning ordinance, these are going to reflect the vision that is listed in the comprehensive plan.
I have a question about how binding is the comprehensive plan?
The comprehensive plan does have to be implemented. Legally speaking, things cannot conflict with the comprehensive plan. So I won't say that you have to absolutely implement every single thing in the comprehensive plan, but you can't directly conflict with it. And the city has to make a good faith effort to be following their comprehensive plan.
Can the comp plan be amended?
Yes, most definitely.
By the council, or how does that work?
It's amended by the council, yeah. And it can be, so amendments can be brought forward by developers or landowners, and the council votes to allow it, yeah.
And it's just a simple majority of the council then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And that's part of the whole living document, right? So as new things come up, sometimes what's in there doesn't make sense anymore and it can be changed.
By the way, are these slides available online somewhere?
Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely have them
I
available.
think they're on the website.
They will be posted.
Yeah.
There's one.
Yeah. So the idea of the comprehensive plan is that planning is an interconnected system. It's all of these different ideas that play together, that come together to make a place. So you can't look at each topic in isolation. Land use is affected by the other thing. So like, let's see. The way you move between the sites is affected by how those sites are laid out. The noise is affected by how the sites are moved out and how you're moving between them. The safety is generally it can be referring to natural hazards, or it can be referring to hazardous materials, but that's often related to geology or the uses that are on that site, gas stations, things like that. So that's also related to land use or circulation. Conservation is related to, so it's all this interconnected system that's all playing together, and you have to consider them all in a holistic way. So those 7 mandatory topics are required by state law to be in a general plan, because we know that those are sort of the backbone of planning. We know that we need to consider all of those things in order to make a good place: land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise, and safety. Then there's additional topics that sort of cut across all of those. So things like how those land uses and transportation infrastructure are distributed, or how and where we preserve open space, natural resources, historic resources, cultural resources, hazard mitigation, how we address climate change. These are all things that could apply to any of those 7 topics, but they're also legally required to be addressed in the comp plan. And then there's a whole list of other things that a city can address in their comp plan. Pretty much anything that they think is important, they can choose to include. And once it's in that plan, it is part of their vision, and they consider it in their development decisions. I know Palo Alto includes economic development. A lot of communities include health, well-being, sustainability, public services. Really anything that they want to put in there can be put in there. And again, these trickle down. So this vision that goes in the comp plan then gets applied to the area plans, and that then gets applied to the zoning code. So then we're going to talk a little bit about the zoning code itself. I'm going to kind of skip over area plans a bit, because I think you guys have a good grasp on that since you've been working on the MVCAP. But of course, if any questions come up, that's fine. The zoning ordinance is part of the municipal code, and it is intended to implement the general plan, and therefore it does have to be consistent with the general plan. It wouldn't make sense for it to not be consistent. It includes all of the different types of uses that can be included in a certain district. So it assigns uses on a site, and then the types of uses that can be, it assigns zones on a site, and then includes the uses that can be in the zones. And within each zone, there's a whole list of different uses that have different levels of approval. So some uses on that site can be included by right, meaning as long as you check the boxes, you fill out your application and everything that the city wants to see you have, then you can build that on the site with just a building permit. You're good. Or you may need a conditional use permit, which means you have to go through an additional level of approval called discretionary approval. So you need to get approval from the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission looks at your application and determines whether or not they think that use is compatible with the surrounding uses. And maybe they put, you know, if they think it's necessary, they may put some additional requirements. And then they can say yes or no, or maybe even kick it up to City Council if they think that's necessary. Or it may just not be approved, or may not be allowed on that site. So just sort of as an illustration, zoning ordinances are not really rocket science a lot of the time. Some of them can be very, very confusing if they're not well written, admittedly, but they're not really rocket science. So parcel 15 up there, I know you don't have a legend, but it's labeled GM, and we know the kind of uses that are allowed, that are often allowed on sites. There's, you know, commercial, residential, industrial. Anyone have any ideas on what GM might stand for? General manufacturing. There you go. So, oh, is it on the bottom? It's on the bottom. All right. So it's not rocket science, right? It's pretty easy to read a zoning map. And so any ideas on like what sort of uses would make sense in a manufacturing zone and, you know, would be compatible with other uses that might be there? Obviously manufacturing, but what else might be in that zone? Bakery? Okay, maybe a bakery. Maybe like a wholesale bakery.
Like a bakery.
Yeah, for sure.
Else to grocery stores or-
For sure, yeah.
Anything else?
We used to have a cement plant,
Yeah.
We did?
like on Park. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different uses that can go in one zone. It doesn't necessarily, like a lot of people will think, well, if it's zoned residential, then only houses can go there. And that's not necessarily true. You can have a lot of different uses in there so long as they're compatible with the primary use. So maybe there could be certain office types that go in a manufacturing zone as long as they're compatible with manufacturing, right? Yeah.
And also the zoning code certainly can be amended as well, so if there are
Yes.
evolving uses that in 2020 don't exist, but in 2021 they do, it's also a document that can be revised. There's also zoning that can be a slash zoning, but that's, you know, you can have two different designations. That's not as common, but I think your explanation is very clear.
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of zoning codes, honestly. And there's some that are very creative. And there's also ways of doing it that are very flexible because there are some get too specific, and then as those uses change and new things evolve, or, you know, things come into being that we didn't know were going to exist, we don't know what zone to put them in. So there's ways of arranging these zones so that they're not so restrictive, and we can be more flexible with the uses. That's very true. Yeah.
So how do you amend the zoning in a more restrictive way? I mean, obviously there is an impact on the people who already own land in that area. So how you go about it?
Zoning code amendments are also done by the city council. So that has to go through the city council.
I would just add to also the idea, oh, thank you. The idea of, you know, up or down zoning is always an interesting concept. Giving somebody either more or less rights with regards to their zoning district that they happen to be in. Sometimes that will happen in municipalities as well. You know, if there's a desire for more housing, perhaps on a site that's deemed as underutilized, it could be upzoned for higher densities. So there's some flexibility in that process.
I just want to remind everyone that it's easy, actually, to find the zoning map for the NVCAP area just by going, I just Googled it online, you know, Palo Alto NVCAP, Palo Alto zoning map, and then focused in on NVCAP. And that chart that's up there now is also really easy to find from there. And I want to just double check. It's been mentioned, I think, a couple of times that we, as a group, can suggest zoning changes. Is that correct? Did I understand it correctly in our final recommendations?
Yeah, so part of what we're doing through the area planning process is coming up with the zoning that will be part of this area. So kind of Della was talking about that kind of drop-down menu of, there's a general plan and it kind of goes down. I think the second level from general plan was specific plan, and then under that, the zoning code. So there would be a zoning code section that would address this specific area.
Yeah.
And the packet that we got did have an excerpt of the SOFA one that I think made it very clear what our result might look like.
Great model to kind of say, okay, what does that mean and how would it look? And it's very clearly and well written.
Teacher, can I get a time check? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so on this one, I want to look at kind of what kind of uses go in zones. So zoning can utilize broad categories, or they can look at very specific categories. And one of the things I wanted to focus on here is the difference between a type of use versus a type of business. So it seems like a very particular nuance, but I think it's something that can get really confusing sometimes. So the difference, for instance, between neighborhood retail, which is a type of use, versus a local business, which is a type of business. So neighborhood retail is like a Walgreens or a Whole Foods, where it is a store that has a radius around it that it is pulling customers from, and it serves that neighborhood around it. And it could be any store, it's just serving the neighborhood around it. Versus a local business, which is specifically a business that could be any type of business owned by a local resident that is not a chain store. It's a one-off, single owner chain store, or not chain store. Does that make sense?
Are you talking about different kinds of zoning?
So these are ways that you can arrange uses within the zoning, and how people can sometimes get confused, and how it's really important in how we word these things when we're writing the zoning ordinance. So when we write the zoning ordinance, we will list out what kind of uses are allowed in a zoning district. And for instance, the next one, tech offices versus local serving offices. If we were to say tech offices, that could encompass a lot of different kinds of offices, right? It could encompass Salesforce, or it could encompass your little local internet company. But if you say local serving offices, that could be a dentist office, or it could be a chiropractor office, or it could be a nonprofit. So you have to be careful in zoning ordinances when we're writing them what kind of use we're talking about, and to use the right language. And when you're reading them, to kind of understand, like if you're the landowner, what the zoning code is trying to get at. Because that language can be really critical to getting the culture and the feel that you're looking for, and also getting the businesses to make sure they can actually thrive within that zone. So I'm gonna skip. I had a little activity here, but I'm gonna skip it because we're over time, and we're going into another activity anyway. So we're gonna talk a little bit about real estate development economics, but before we do that, we have this role play skit that Rachel has come up with that is wonderful. Give you all the credit.
Thank you. Were there air quotes around that? Did you hear
them? Do you want to introduce it, or should I?
I can introduce it. This is really just an attempt to try to make something that, if as much as I love, reading and writing, numbers and math were not my strong suit in school. It's not like what I wanted to get into. So if your eyes glazed over when you were reading the pro forma handouts, you are not alone. So this is an attempt to make it fun and interactive. It'll only be as fun as you make it, though. So we have a little skit. And you don't have to stand up. It'll be kind of like, Reader's Theater here. We'll be sitting down so we can use our microphones and hear your voice. And we'll have different folks take roles. You can see the roles up here, the cast. So different folks will take roles. You should have a script. It looks like this here. And so we'll just kind of read through it and have some fun with numbers and real estate. And then we will move on to there to kind of have a little bit of a redux of it, and then we'll kind of get into housing. And then we'll hear from a real estate developer who does affordable housing. So she'll kind of give us the real life scoop on kind of where we got it right and maybe some more nuanced details of the development process. So with that in mind, who would like to be real estate developer number 1? Angela, great. And who would like to join her as number 2? I'm not above assigning people, so. All right, Terry, thank you. City planner, who's always been wanting to be a city planner? Okay, Kirsten. Property owner?
I'll go.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Architect, who's been wanting to be an architect or already is an architect? Do you want to reprise your real life role? Alex, Uncle Steve, that's the rich uncle, so who wants to be Uncle Steve? Gail, is that a look? Okay. General contractor. There's only a few people who don't have roles. Waldeck, you made eye contact. All right, that's you. And bank loan officer. Yunan, do you want to be the bank loan officer? Sure. Okay, thank you. All right, so it should be pretty easy. I will advance the slides and Della will keep you on track with your roles. So we have for ourselves scene 1, the property.
Can we start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. You won't believe it. I found a property with a great location that I think could become housing.
What's so great about it?
It's right near a Caltrain station, so it's easy to get to jobs in downtown San Francisco or downtown San Jose.
That's certainly a great asset. What is it now?
A parking lot.
That's great. I'll check the zoning and see what we are allowed to build there. Can you check what the rents are in the market?
Sure.
Hi, city planner. Thanks for meeting with me. I am interested in a property located at 1000 Apartment Avenue. Can you confirm how many units I'm allowed to build there? And other restrictions?
I'm happy to help, but this might take quite a while.
That's not in the script.
That lot is 90 by 80 feet, which is a total of 7,200 square feet. Based on the zoning for this area, you're allowed to build up to 30 feet. That's 3 stories, unless you have retail on the ground floor.
Great. What's the unit density?
That's RM 30, which allows the equivalent of 40 dwelling units per acre.
That means I can have 6 units there. Thank you. Anything else?
Well, actually, there's plenty more, but that's enough to get you started.
And if I can ask people to please use their microphones, that'd be great.
I found out about the rents in the neighborhood. Based on what I see currently, I think we can rent the apartments for about $1 per square foot.
Kansas City?
These are made-up numbers to ease with understanding the
see.
overall
Okay.
process. Yes.
No, it slowed me down a minute.
I found out we can have a total of 6 units there.
Great info. I have the property owner, architect, general contractor coming by right now to talk costs.
Thanks for discussing buying my parking lot. I looked at your offer and I'd like to counter.
Well, this seems a bit high.
Well, I think you forgot to include the money I make from people who pay to use my parking lot. Capital gains taxes I have to pay.
This is higher than expected. We have a budget. Can you do this amount?
Okay, this will work. Wow, that was easy.
I hope I get to be the architect on this project. Here's my proposal for this project. I looked through the planning code, took a look at the site, and put together a staff and sub-consultant team that can really make a difference, that really can make a great project.
I also hope I get to general contractor of this project, I look at the current construction costs, which are really high. Material, labor, and equipment are scarce right now. Given that, here is my proposal for how much it will take to build the building.
When I add up the soft costs from the architect and the hard costs from the general contractor, I get $100,000 to construct each unit.
Multiply that by 6 units, and the whole project will cost about $600,000 to build. Based on the rent, our gross income is $108,000 annually.
About 35% of our income has to go to maintaining the building, taxes, and other expenses. That's $37,800.
Taking the income, subtracting the expenses means that our net operating income is $70,200.
We have to pay off our debt to the bank at 4.5%, so that's $18,900.
Which means our total cash flow is $43,740. I think that is enough to persuade investors and lenders to work with us. Let's raise $600,000.
Welcome to San Francisco Bank. I'm a loan officer. What can I help you with today?
We have a proposal to construct a new apartment building.
We need a total of $600,000. We would like 70% of that to be loaned from Palo Alto Bank.
420,000 loan. Let me do some calculation. Everything works out. Your experience and this project seems solid. You are approved.
What will be our interest rate?
We'll lend you $420,000 at an interest rate of 4.5%.
Perfect. Now we just need to raise $180,000 from equity investors.
Why are we here to meet with you, with your uncle?
We need an equity investor for our project.
What is an equity investor?
Well, an equity investor is someone who has access to cash. The person will invest money into the project, hoping to make a return on that money.
And what if your numbers don't pan out like you predict?
Well, in that case, the equity investors lose money, or at least don't make as much as we hoped. Hi, Uncle Steve. Thanks for meeting with us.
I am happy to meet with you, but I looked at the numbers here and I don't see that I'll be getting much return on any investment that I ever make on this.
What do you mean?
Well, I want at least 20% return on my investment over 10 years. Looking at your pro forma, there isn't enough cash flow to sustain that return.
Oh, I see. That would be $21,600 a year to you.
Yes, and I don't want to be the only one with something to lose. I'm only willing to give you 15%.
Oh, that means we still need $90,000.
I could consider lowering my rate of return, but in exchange for greater ownership stake in the property, so that when you sell it, I get 50% of the profits.
Whoa. Well, thanks for hearing us out. We'll take another look at our numbers and consider your offer. We'll be back again soon.
And that's the end of the scene. More to come. Very well done, everyone. Thank you all for indulging in that exercise. It was, as you could tell, very hypothetical, a very low-cost world that they were living in. We only wish we could live in that kind of world.
And the 20% yield.
I really want to get some funds from that. So just to kind of, I'm going to back up a slide. Now, even though this is fictional numbers, again, we're just trying to underscore the types of things that go into a developer, whether they're, in this case, for-profit or even nonprofit with some different line items, the things I have to think about, which is all the costs that are going to go into constructing, which include what are called hard costs, which are things like the land and the building materials, as well as soft costs, financing, the permit fees, the architect, and that totals into what the cost is going to be to build that project. They're going to look at what's the income per square foot, the rent, kind of all those things about, you know, how many units, what's the size, where is it going to be, et cetera. And then kind of over time, whether it's a 10-year payback or whatever their time period is, they're going to look at their investments, both kind of what's the income annually and how will they raise the capital, whether it's debt, like they're going to the bank, or some other lender who's going to say, you got to pay me money with interest no matter what, or like Uncle Steve, equity investor who says, I'm going to take a risk and give you some money on the hopes that I get a return. And if things go south, I'm going down with you. So these are just some of the things that come into play, and kind of building on what Della was talking about. On that left side, you see the unit count, the unit size, the height, the stories. Some of those things, particularly the height of the building and the number of stories and the use overall, are dictated by the zoning code. So when we think about, again, general plan, specific plans, and then the zoning code, what the community, right, the city decides, we as, democratic institution decide what can be where. We are kind of, and how it looks, how high it can be, what kind of uses, we're kind of impacting it there. And then the market kind of takes over for a lot of the other costs, except for maybe the planning and permitting fees and impact fees that come from the city. So again, just trying to show some of the pressures that folks are under. So the key takeaways would be, in the pro forma, you'll hear that tool a lot. Here's another one on the right side. That's from the Pro Forma 101. That was by Wayne Lemon. And so it's a tool for evaluating costs and revenues of developing land. Will this be worth it? Or you might hear people say, does it pencil, right? Does it all pencil out? Income must outweigh the costs for development to happen, and there are many factors that go into what those costs and those revenues are. So again, zoning and development, all these factors combine to either promote or inhibit development. What's allowed, what land is even available, what's the land cost, construction costs, location, the local economy, et cetera. And then some additional takeaways that, again, it's an interconnected system. Zoning guides what can be built, but can't mandate what is built. So just because something's allowed to be built on a site doesn't mean that that landowner will build that thing, either because they don't want to, they like what's there currently, they can't afford it, investors don't want to invest money into it, or maybe it doesn't pencil. When you add up all the costs and the revenues, it doesn't make any money, and so they can't build what's allowed. And developing land, then, is a partnership between the landowners and the city. And so we as a community work with those who own land to try to say, we want to see this vision, our general plan, come to use. How can we best set up policies and zoning that are going to, in collaboration with those folks who own the land, make those things come to fruition? Unless it's a public project where the city owns it and the city or other public agency is taking that on. So I want to pause before we jump into the housing. Sorry, I just had to see what slide was next. I'm going to pause for some questions, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about housing, which is another kind of more specific part of land development.
How does below market units, how do we specify that in zoning?
That is in the next section, so I will answer that, but it's just coming up. Tim?
Very simplified, but I appreciate the effort. I thought a very interesting comment that you jumped over fairly quickly that might, in this particular case, be worth putting another minute of time on, and that was the response from the parking lot owner that he already has an income stream, and that income stream actually establishes a value for the land, not the land zoning itself. So if you capitalize the income that's currently on that property, that establishes the
Sorry,
value
can you
of
talk to the mic a little bit more? We're getting, our tech guy is letting us know we're not talking to the mic very well, so sorry
I
about
don't
that.
want to be quoted here, so. What's happening now in the Bay Area is everything's already built, right? We don't have very many places that are not built on. Everything has got some kind of economic return already. So the challenge, which is in our case is real here, is that you have an existing building that has income, and that income's capitalized, and that is the valuation of the existing property, not what necessarily the future use is. So I think whether you come back to it or not, in our current environment in the Bay Area, that's a very big, important thing to think about when we want to visualize what could be somewhere, is you got to talk the owner into an economic model that makes it worth it to him or her to sell their land for you to redevelop the site for something even higher and better use. So I think we shouldn't just quickly gloss over that particular point. Thank you.
That's great. Other either takeaways that you had from this skit or other materials, or questions that you have?
Well, I did read through the pro forma information. There were 2 articles to read. And I came away with the sense that maybe it's not really possible to build a housing development that pencils if it includes below market rate housing and parking in this area right now. It just seems like impossible. So I don't know what the alternatives are or what one does in that case. And so I wanted to ask if I understood that properly when I read it. It just seems like you only barely make it above the line, you know, if you don't include any below market rate or and if you don't require parking. That's the only way you can make it work.
I'm gonna say a little thing and then pass it over to Diane if she's ready to maybe take that question, because it's right in your wheelhouse. I think part of the balancing act that happened in this endeavor of trying to build housing is trying to figure out, I mean, many people trying to figure out, the developer, maybe it's the city, maybe it's, you know, whomever, what is the balance between things that we can, as a city, ask for development to include, below market rate units, parking, et cetera. Maybe it's a park, maybe there's other amenities we want. And where does that become so expensive that, you know, it goes above what can make a return? I think that's maybe the point that those are trying to make. And the particular article that was about housing specifically, I think, and very specific to the Bay Area, was looking and saying when we add parking costs, especially if they're structured parking costs, that can be so expensive that if you look at even for market rate what you can get for rent, especially for below market rate what you can then get a return, it just makes the numbers kind of go out of whack, and so it can be hard to sustain that. But I'm going to ask Diane if she wants. I don't build housing, I just think about it. So if she wants to talk about that.
Okay. Rachel, I thought that was an excellent answer, and I think that was that the Does It Pencil article? Okay, and which I think is an excellent primer on what developers go through. But I think the point is that it's a bunch of different trade-offs. And I work in affordable housing, so our trade-offs are a little bit different. But in the market rate world, I think that one of the things that you see is that you see only luxury housing being built, because that's the only thing where you can get the rents high enough to be able to pay for all the additional things that cities are requiring of developers, whether it's parking, whether it's parks, whether it's whatever the requirement is. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Use your mic. Use your microphone.
Part way. So yeah, the whole thing about rents, it also seemed as if some of the articles, and I can't remember exactly where in the whole, all the things you gave us, it said this, but it seemed that the rental, the costs, the people who would be able to rent these apartments that were built according to the theoretical building that they were creating, people wouldn't be able to afford them. To live in them. People who are rental customers wouldn't be able to afford the cost. And there was also something that Kirsten pointed out about how for 45% of renters, already the cost of renting is a huge burden. So I wonder, again, I just wonder what happens when it's impossible for things to pencil out. I guess that's my question.
Market rate developers stop building. That's basically the bottom line. Or look for very creative solutions. For example, on one of the projects that I'm working on that we'll talk about later, we made a point to not do structured parking for that very reason, because that parking is very expensive. Developers will also ask for exceptions to parking ratios or certain concessions from the city to be able to build housing.
We'll do Gail, Keith, and then I think we'll just kind of come around. Looks like we got a
Yes,
little
I think
slew.
the other thing to remember in so-called affordable housing, which is a very strange phrase in this region, the issue is it does require, I believe, it's fair to say, public subsidy. I mean, the fact is there's public sources, some limited or available public monies that help make these projects even sort of feasible. And without public subsidy to do that, all the things we're talking about make sense in terms of some of the constraints. And also just quickly on the partnership here on the takeaway, I know this is an important statement. There are a lot of stakeholders in developing land, right? Not just landowners in city, you got elected, you have community, you have the potential users of the site. So I think that really simplifies it, but there are a lot of stakeholders that have varying amounts of influence in this process.
I should say, when I write city up there, I mean the public. So we, as the city and the community, as the bearers of like the public interests, are kind of cooperating with a private individual or individuals to try to figure out how do we get our public interests kind of, persuaded in that development. Okay, I see Waldeck, and then we'll go to Keith, and then I think Kirsten did you? Okay, so we'll do those three, and then come down here, Terry.
So how about the size of the units? Because I grew up in Europe, and well, in Poland in particular, for us, 650 square feet, that was a residence for 4 people. And here, 850, it's like 2-bedroom apartment, right? So why is it sticking like that?
Well, I think especially on the I think there is a trend towards smaller units, and you see that in both market rate and affordable development. We have regulations on how small we can make our units, but you'll notice that a lot of market rate developers are making smaller and smaller units for that reason, just to make things work with the penciling it out.
So why doesn't supply and demand kick in? If it's so unattractive and so hard to make a profit on this, then any land that's zoned for residential, I think, would be very unattractive, and the price would go down. And wouldn't that at some point equalize, and now you'd be able to buy it at such a low price that you could actually build on it and make a reasonable profit?
Do you want to take that one?
It was what I was speaking to. There's no greenfield orchards anymore.
Right.
Right. So it goes back to what is the possible generation of value with its existing use. And that's the value of the land, whether you're going to redevelop it or buy it and keep it the way it is, that's the value of the land. And that value, regardless of the zoning, can continue being at that level because I rent my parking lot and I make money off my parking lot. I'm not going to change the use.
Right. And I think another thing to remember is that the land isn't the only cost here. And construction might be constructing housing, it might be constructing bridges, it might be constructing commercial. So there's a lot of other areas that the consultants, the contractors, et cetera, can play in.
But talk about parking lot, then if you could make the same on a parking lot as you could for building, then wouldn't the cost of rent, wouldn't the demand for rent go up to raise the price of that demand so that now you could actually make money off that? Sooner or later, someone has to live somewhere, and so I would think that supply and demand would equalize all this, and you'd be able to, if it's zoned residential, build residential units on it.
I mean, I think overall, this is not meant to be a pat answer, but we have a lot of human beings operating the supply and demand curve here, right? So people own the land and they get to make their choice about whether they want to sell it and for how much they want to sell it. We've got people going into or not going to construction trades and coming from all parts of the country to work in construction trades, and people building projects and bidding up the prices of what they'll pay the workers. And then you have materials, they come from somewhere. So you have all these factors and all these different supply and demand curves that are converging, of which land is only one. And if somebody doesn't want to sell their property for whatever reasons, they can't become something else. And so that's not try to be trite, but just to say there's a lot of things influencing it. And some would say that the rents are already at the top of the demand, right? They're as high as they can go, and there aren't enough people and households who can pay even higher. And so that gets stuck where it is, and then everything else has to kind of adjust too. So we'll go to Doria, and then Kirsten, sorry, and maybe Doria has a response to this question or this topic.
I don't have an answer to that question. But I do have an observation, and that is that what are we trying to solve here? Are we trying to solve a nationwide problem, what might be a nationwide market or trend which might change, or are we trying to maintain what we think is reasonable quality of living for our neighbors and our future neighbors in Palo Alto? And I would suggest if we only focus on the value, the cost of building, while I appreciate it, and everybody, You know, there's people who own a lot of land and people who own a little bit of land and people who own no land, and we're all part of the community. So I think we're focusing on the wrong thing. I think we should be focusing on advising the city council on what kind of development in this very small area that we're asking a lot of, we need the most in Palo Alto. And I would suggest that we have entitled various residential projects, including one pretty big deed restricted subsidized project and one pretty big market rate project, and other smaller ones within the last few years. Totally. Now, are they all going to be built? No, because we don't, as you said, Rachel, we don't build, the city doesn't build housing. So, but do we want to recommend building housing or not building housing to the to any extent that we would prefer to optimize the return on the property to the property owners and incentivize office? No, so I don't think so. I think we want to recommend the best we can do, and then we can hope that that we maintain reasonable development standards so that people live the way we would want to live. You know, people aren't going to live in bigger houses in the future except a very few. We know that. But, I mean, I think we're focusing on the wrong thing. Let's focus on what we can actually achieve in this area. And I would suggest one of the most reasonable ways to do it would be to look at all the mixed use and RM30 zone properties in the area that can be 50 feet or at whatever height they can be, and see what actual number of units we can achieve. And then it is always up to each property owner whether they want to maximize or optimize their property. So I wish we could focus a little more on that kind of thing. And I hope that we can get Mr. Hirsch back sometime and give him a little more time to because I know he's been working on this a long time, and we didn't have him on the agenda, so I appreciate that, but maybe we can agendize him for the next meeting.
Thank you, Doria. I think a part of maybe to go back to what you said, kind of the beginning of Angela's question was, you know, looks like parking and some other things make it really hard to do below market rate units, and I think part of what the point that I want to yes hand from you is we can think about what can we do to the extent feasible to help actualize housing. And we don't control everything, right? We don't control the levers, but what levers can we pull? And we're not going to solve all the problems in the region or even in Palo Alto, but we can try to get closer to helping realize housing, and we can bring some of those costs down maybe for the developers so that the person says, yeah, I do want to sell, and yeah, I do want to build, and we get some more of those projects going. So it's not impossible. It is happening, and we can even make it happen or try our best to be part of having it happen more. I think that's a great
Right,
great way
and
to
I
phrase
also want to point out that there's very little evidence that suggests that people who live in deed-restricted, subsidized housing, which is what BMR housing is, except at the very, very lowest levels, don't actually need cars as much or more than those of us who are more fortunate in this area. And we have our own 2 studies in Palo Alto by Fair and Pierce to prove that. The only multifamily housing that they found should be not parked at the rates we had currently, which is 1 per studio, 1 bedroom and 2 for 2 or more bedrooms, was housing for retired persons and elderly people. So I want to keep that in mind because I want to make sure as we try to make more attractive to developers to make more money and property owners to make more money, I'm not picking on anyone, that we don't make it really harder for people to live in these situations. It's really important, I think.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. And then we'll go to Terry, and then we're going to move on to housing more in depth.
I'll keep it short.
It's okay.
If we continue to do exactly what we have been doing and continue to accede or not fight against the limitations, our trajectory is not optimistic. It has people living 3, 4, 5 hours away. I know a cop in Menlo Park that lives in Reno and flies down to work his shifts, okay? I don't know if you've heard of global warming,
But one of the most intractable parts of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory in Palo Alto is our commute. It's the only part of our greenhouse gas emissions that has not responded to efforts of the city to bring it down. In fact, it's going the other direction. And the primary reason is because of supercommuters, both in and out of the city. So although I realize everything that everyone is saying is very valid, I just would encourage my fellow study team members to say, yes, but let's fight harder to be part of the solution, because if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem.
Thank you, Kirsten. Terry?
Very quickly, and I'll try to be short. Commercial impact fees and business taxes. Do you think those are good ideas, that cities should help with funding? Because again, as we mentioned earlier, there needs to be a public and private partnership to build more housing. And the one way to get more funding, or to get more, to lower the cost of the housing, is those factors. And I'd be curious to know how you feel about those things.
Well, as an affordable housing developer who works on deed-restricted, publicly subsidized housing, of course I think it's a great idea, because then we can build more affordable housing. We need land, we need money, and we need personnel to move it forward, and money is one of those things. So,
okay, one quick comment on that, and that is, I do think that our impact fees in the city are extremely low, extremely low. They're not even at the county level. And it's an embarrassment that they aren't higher as citizens of this city. And I think that's a major factor, as well as you mentioned, the other costs of building, constructing, hiring labor. I used to work for a construction firm, so I know very well the cost of labor and the impacts of getting materials as well. So I think that all of those are factors that also impact housing and what we can build as well. And sometimes those things are overlooked by just saying, oh, if we just zone for a certain thing, that'll happen. A lot of times, even if we zone for something, it doesn't happen because of these other factors. So
that's correct. And I can't speak, obviously, to some of the flip side of impact fees for commercial development, because I do residential. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through a little bit of housing. We already talked a little bit about kind of affordable housing, and then we're going to turn over. We have a little bit of kind of queued up Q&A for Diane, and then you guys will have time to ask her questions. So if you have questions about some of the things I asked, please write them down. I'll try to get through it, and then we'll get to Diane so that we can maximize her time. Okay, so the housing affordability crisis. So one of the links in your packet was a study from 2015, but I think still very relevant, from the state, that kind of looked at, why is California's housing so expensive? And a couple of things they really noted as kind of the root causes were the annual housing supply growth in the coast has slowed in particular. So particularly California's coastal cities, it has slowed, although there's some evidence in other parts of the state as well. So you can see in that chart there, the white line is the housing supply on the coast kind of going down, and then the inland is on the blue line there. So since kind of the 60s, it's kind of been going down relative to the annual amount of new housing built is going down, so it's a percentage. And so if our population is continuing to grow, or we're not continuing to build housing, then those people may have to double up or find other means and places to live, or live further away. In addition, the land costs and the construction costs themselves we just talked about are high. And then, maybe we'll just take 1 second, turn to your neighbor and answer this question. Has the affordability crisis impacted you or someone you know, and in what way has it happened? Okay, so how has that impacted you? So. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to share your story. I know that was a brief time. Too much. I know. Okay, guys, we gotta bring it back. That was supposed to be quick. I know you guys love talking to each other. It's really good. Okay, we're gonna go on to the next slide. Defining affordability. So affordability is often a word that we use, and it means different things to different people. So we're going to talk about how does the federal government kind of define affordability. And so there's kind of just generally affordable. How do I know that my housing that I live in is affordable to me and my household? Or how might you know it's affordable to you? And so that's where the Department of Housing and Urban Development says that if you're paying like 30% or less of your household's income for your housing costs, then your housing is affordable to you. And there's debate about whether that's the right number, but that's what the percentage is. If you're paying more than 30%, we say those households are cost burdened. And if you're paying more than 50% of your income from your household for your housing costs, you're severely cost burdened. And so this table here is showing the San Jose, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara metropolitan statistical area and the cost burden percentage by tenancy. So about 36% of those who live in this region, in our little sub-region of the greater region, are cost burdened. 17% are severely cost burdened. And then when you break it down by tenancy of renter and owner, you see that 45% of renters are cost burdened and 23% are severely cost burdened. So you can see a good portion of our community is facing pretty high costs. So when you have to pay that much money of your income for your housing costs, you don't have money for transportation, you don't have money for clothes, for childcare, for recreation, for the things that we might want to enjoy in our lives, vacations, things like that. So it can be pretty severe. And then we go on to say, okay, so those are the people who might be struggling and having a difficulty affording their houses, but then where do we put our public resources when we are providing subsidy either for building a unit or allowing someone to live in a subsidized housing unit, or perhaps giving them a voucher so they can go and get a housing unit? And so this table is the Santa Clara County table. HUD also looks at all the regions across the county or the country, and in certain regions like ours that are very expensive, they create tables of your area's median income, and then they break that down by different tranches. So you can see one person who has an income of $30,000 a year, they'd be considered extremely low because they're making 30% of the area's total median income. Or you can see a household of 4 persons that makes $103,000 a year, they would be considered low income. So these are different kind of gradations of how we measure income, and that affects who might be served by a household. So even if somebody, let's say, could be cost burdened or severely cost burdened, but maybe they make more money than is in this table, their median income, or their household is still higher, they could still be struggling, they could be still spending a high portion of their income on their rent, but they might not be considered eligible for certain subsidized programs, kind of depending on where they fall. So what do we do about that? So on the supply side, in terms of increasing the amount of affordable housing units that are available, there's a couple things that we tend to do. We might build inclusionary housing units. So there'd be housing units that are available below the market rate, but we would ask a developer through ordinances and through local laws to say you have to build a certain percentage of your housing units that you're going to build have to be available for rent below the market rate. We might decide what units, what area median incomes those are available to and who they're available to, and we say you're going to build it so it exists in this building and it's kind of part of that community. We also might build a building like what Diane does.
Is that part of the zoning, or is that like the planning and transportation would negotiate that?
It's usually not negotiated parcel by parcel. There's a set law that kind of lays out, how the percentage would apply. And in Palo Alto, it's 15% for sale buildings are below market rate. And then developers may, like for rental, for example, they may pay a housing impact fee, and that fee would go to the city, and then it goes to building more housing. And so that's something that we might be able to give to Palo Alto Housing or other organizations who are building the next bucket, which is the 100% affordable unit. So that's a building where all of the units are available to people who are renting below the market rate. And then lastly, we might try to create more overall housing. And I think to Doria's point, whether we can, decrease the cost of rent by building enough housing, I don't know that Palo Alto can do that alone, certainly, but regionally, if enough housing is built over time, we could catch up to some of the underbuilding, and hopefully, the hope is that the rents would go down and soften because there's more housing supply. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Diane, because she's here with us, and I have a few questions that are lined up for you, which I will tell you, I told her ahead of time, so she was ready. And then we'll just have questions from you guys. So please jot down your questions that you might have for her. We'd love first to know a little bit about just Palo Alto Housing, what you guys do, and who you serve, and kind of fill us in on the work that you guys do.
Okay, Palo Alto Housing, we're a local affordable housing developer, and we develop and manage and then provide services to the residents of 100% affordable housing in this area. Currently, we have over just about 800 units across 28 different sites in Palo Alto, and we just opened our first non-Palo Alto site, which is in Mountain View. And we have another 400 units in the pipeline, and we house a little over 2,000 people. So
pretty impressive. Do you want to tell us a little bit about a recent project that you guys have designed?
Sure. So I don't know if you are familiar with Maybell. Some of you may know that name. But after we sold our Maybell property, because it was I don't know what the verb is for that, referendarized. But yeah, it was killed unceremoniously. We then, as an organization, I wasn't with the organization at that time, but decided to develop outside of Palo Alto. And so we just developed a 67-unit building in Mountain View, and we have another one that's coming on, that's under construction now in Redwood City. And then this one I'm going to tell you about is our next one up. And this is what it looks like now. Because we're in Silicon Valley, we have a code name for it, and it is Taco Bellagio. So right now it's a Taco Bell. In a few months it'll start construction, and there we go. There we go. Okay, and this is what we'll have there. This is 71 units of affordable housing. They're all studios, and it is on 0.6 acres. And here's the view from the street, and so in looking at how we decided to do this, we went through the process that you guys have been learning about. We talked to the landowner. They wanted to sell. We negotiated that. The landowner was actually the owner of the Taco Bell, so he's leasing back from us and continuing to sell burritos and all that other stuff, so for at least the time being. And then looked at the zoning. In affordable housing, we have density bonuses, so we can normally build more on a land than a market rate developer can, and also have concessions. So there are a few things that we don't necessarily have to meet. For example, on this property, as you'll see in the site plan next, we have 32 parking spaces. So we have a 0.45 parking ratio, which based on our studies in Mountain View and the studies that Mountain View has commissioned, is adequate. And actually, in our Palo Alto properties, 90% of them have excess parking. They're not. There's not too much, not a shortage of parking at those sites.
You know, I live near the treehouse down in Charleston.
Oh yeah.
What was the parking ratio for that?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head. Sorry.
It was like
I know it was reduced. Yeah, I know it was reduced, but I don't know exactly what it was.
Yeah, because we thought it would be totally filled, and it's not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah. And what we're finding, for example, this property is on El Camino Real, and we're finding that good access to transit. This is right off of Castro Street, so there's a lot that's walkable, and it's also close to the train station. So there's ways for people to get around. We also then, after looking at some of those things, and decided what population we wanted to house. And right now, the last two projects we've done have been 100% affordable, with high percentages of permanent supportive housing, primarily homeless veterans. And since we hadn't done a lot of permanent supportive housing, we felt like we really wanted to do something different, just so that all of the projects in our pipeline were not permanent supportive housing. So on this one, we wanted to also serve special needs. So 21 21% of the units are for adults with developmental disabilities, which also typically don't drive, so that helps with our parking ratio as well. And the rest of the units are for residents who live or work in Mountain View, and their AMI is between 50 and 70%. Then we also look at financing on this, and let's see, I can just flip through a couple of these. Oh, whoops, sorry. Okay, never mind. No, that's okay. Don't worry. Don't worry about it. You don't need them. I can just speak to the rest of it. What we ended up doing for financing on this project is that we'll do 4% tax credits, and you guys can ask me about that if you want. We also have a sizable loan from the city of Mountain View, just their contribution to our affordable housing, and then we'll also take out a mortgage based on the rents that we do have. So that's overall what this project looks like, and I'm sure, I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Okay, last question for me. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it, what 3 things would you change to make housing more affordable?
Well, I think that the 3 things that you need to build housing are land, people, and money. Simple, but that's a little bit of a flip answer. But land is very important. And for example, our Oak Court project was part of the SOFA 1 that you guys have been also looking at. And so that gave us the land to be able to really provide a lot of housing in Palo Alto. And some recent state legislation has also enabled cities and counties to look at excess land and make that available for affordable housing. So that would be ask number 1. Ask number 2 would be people. Not surprisingly, it is hard for us to hire people because it's really, really hard to live here. It's hard to find people who can afford to live for what we can afford to pay as a nonprofit, who can afford to live in the peninsula area, and nobody, excuse me, and nobody really wants to commute from the East Bay or Reno or wherever they're commuting. So, so having people who are interested, talented, and can afford to live here would be my second ask. And my third one would be that that we streamline things. I think Palo Alto has certainly made progress in streamlining. For example, the affordable housing overlay, thank you, and it is helpful. And some SB 35, I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but that removes some discretionary review. Our Redwood City project was approved through SB 35, and it made the project move along much faster, which means that we can deliver affordable housing more quickly.
All right, so questions from you guys. Gail, and then Waldeck.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Your comment about that the tenants or future tenants for the property would be live or work in Mountain View. How recently has that been achieved and not being contrary to fair housing laws? I mean, is that really happening? Because that's been a concept for a long time about priority for people within close proximity.
That has to do with the source of the funding, and depending on the source of the funding, you can't always assure that. In this case, we don't have, for example, on our other projects, we have money from the VA. If we're taking money from the VA, we can't specify that those folks are from Mountain View. Federal funding, yes. But in this case, we don't have any federal funding in the project. So we can do a Mountain View live work preference. And that applies only to those units. For example, with the project that we just opened, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, the 21% you said.
Those are for developmentally disabled adults, yes. No, for example, with our other project that we've done in Mountain View, the money from the VA applies to the 25 units that are for the VA.
I see. So that's site by site, depending on the funding?
It's unit by unit, actually.
Unit by unit, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Waldeck, and then we'll go to Alex.
So I have a little bit of a concern, because with the concept that you have 15% of the housing being affordable within each development. It is a distribution of people with lower means. But if we start concentrating this, and then we are recreating the city projects again.
Right.
And I spend my time in Detroit and Chicago to know that it's not always, it's economical, but is it really good social policy?
Well, and I think that it depends, you have to look at it in a larger context, and concentration of poverty is a real thing. And so there are a lot of incentives in place in the tax credit system and a lot of our other financing mechanisms that really reward and make it possible to build housing that isn't concentrated in lower income areas. And for example, we get extra points for building in high income areas on some of our more competitive funding.
Alex?
Oh, sorry.
I think we're looking at a large increase in the number of seniors in the next 10 years, or 10 to 20 years. What are your thoughts about affordable senior housing?
We would love to build more affordable senior housing. That hasn't been an area, we've really focused on a lot of families, but maybe I'll, but it's going to be an important area. I mean, I think when you look at homeless statistics in particular, they really show that a lot of our homeless population is older seniors, or single seniors.
Great, thank you. Did you have a question?
Just a quick comment, Waldeck, on your point there. I just wanted to add that, when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, I lived in a redeveloped area, and there was a sixplex that we lived in. There was about, I'd say 100 units or so in the development itself, and there was 15% affordable, but they were, the folks that were below market rate or permanently affordable units were mixed in with all other folks in the development. It's just that their mortgages are set up differently. There's no difference in the look of the house. They're mixed in. It's a very workable solution to incorporate below market rate into market rate housing.
Other questions? Angela?
I didn't quite understand the 4% tax somethings.
Okay, tax credits. The way that we're financed, and this is an oversimplification of it, is that individual corporate investors are allowed to buy tax credits in exchange for providing us the equity. So Uncle Steve might would get tax credits to reduce her tax bill in exchange for us getting equity. And there's two different types. There's 4% and 9%. Up until just very recently, 4% has been non-competitive, 9% where you get more equity has been competitive.
I just want to call you on that. Uncle Steve did not tell you their pronouns.
She stands corrected.
Okay.
Doria?
So I think it's great when you can actually have a community that doesn't need to have cars or can't have cars as much. That's really helpful to solve that problem. And then does Palo Alto Housing ever repurpose existing buildings? Is that more expensive or harder to predict, or does that ever happen? And do you ever think about whether or not we should have stricter inclusionary zoning laws in Palo Alto for rental units and smaller numbers of smaller developments?
Okay, so I'm sorry, first question, second question, third question. So,
you want me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Remember. So it was about Section 8, if you have any comments about that, housing, people that have federal Section 8 status of housing, and if you deal with any kind of assistance to those people, because I've heard from people anecdotally that they have a hard time finding housing. And maybe you don't do that at all. And then repurposing existing buildings.
Yes, okay.
And perhaps having different inclusionary housing requirements.
Okay.
More broad inclusionary housing and environments in Palo Alto, and to speak to Valdek's comment, spreading them out instead of having them concentrated.
Okay. All right, so Section 8, we don't help Section 8 voucher holders to find housing. There are other organizations like Abode Services that do. We have Section 8 within our building, but those Section 8 vouchers are tied to our buildings. So they're called project-based vouchers versus tenant-based vouchers. So there's two different kinds. And so if a tenant moves out, then that Section 8 voucher stays with that unit, and a new tenant will income qualify and will move in. We have not yet repurposed a building. It's a great idea. We just haven't found economically that it has worked. And in many cases, for example, we're looking at one project now where the building on the site is unreinforced masonry. So, that's not going to happen. So, and also on the land costs are so high that to make our projects pencil, we normally need to build high and dense, and what is existing is normally lower and less dense. So that's why it hasn't worked for us. And for inclusionary housing, I think that there are a lot of trends for requiring developers to build that as part of their development instead of having it go into an affordable housing fund. And I don't know that I have a strong opinion either way, but I think that's more of a city-by-city decision.
Great. Kirsten, anybody else have a hand? It's Keith. Anybody else? We're going to wrap up in a second. Okay.
Do you have a strong feeling about in lieu fees versus actual units? Because I know that that's controversial sometimes.
It is controversial. I think from a Palo Alto housing perspective, we certainly appreciate in lieu fees because it allows us to build housing. But I think that what I've seen is that often the in lieu fees are lower than the cost of actual housing. And so if our goal is to have more housing, then typically actually building it would be better. But also to give you the flip side, depending on who's living there, the developer who's building those units might not be set up to support that population. For example, if you have homeless veterans, for example, they have specific needs, and that might not be a place where they would be able to thrive without the support services that we would provide in the kind of development that we're doing.
So the city sets the in lieu fees?
Yes, the city sets the fees, and we have to do a study to kind of justify what the fees are set at, and we can revise that from time to time.
Okay. You mentioned density bonuses, and maybe this is a question also for Rachel. How does that work with zoning? So you get a bonus, but you're violating the zoning, so do you get an exception to zoning, or do they change the zoning, or how do you get that density?
I'll let you answer that one because you can speak specifically to how Palo Alto does
Yeah,
it.
I wish I could speak very, very specifically to how we do it. Unfortunately, I'm relatively new and I haven't had to process an application, but this specifically, I think that the bonus she's referencing, the state density bonus, for example, again, we are creatures of the state, and so the state laws kind of supersede our laws in that regard. Different cities have, to some degree, there's kind of some meeting of minds on how to interpret the state density bonus law, and the law continues to evolve. So I don't know, Chitra, if you know the answer to that question of how we process state density. I can get back to you guys on that in the next meeting, but it's a good question to ask.
And also for upzoning, could a developer come to you and say, I want to upzone, I want higher density, but I'll increase the percentage of affordable units? Is that common? Is that possible?
Whether it's common, I don't know that, well, people, landowners, developers can approach and say, hey, I have this proposal, and, the city could try to kind of negotiate what the terms would be, and if the planning commission, city council, thought it was good, we could figure out a way to, amend whatever codes were necessary to have that happen. Some cities, for like large projects, for example, will do what's called development agreements. And these are usually very big projects where there's lots of land to be developed. And so maybe you're almost making a whole new neighborhood, or you're redeveloping a giant factory or something into something new. And so maybe you'll have something different that might not be suitable for every little parcel, but in a big area is doable. And so that's typically the scale that you would have to have that. Tim, I don't know if you want to speak to that in regards to like, you know, working with different cities when you guys are trying to develop things, kind of how you have to maybe approach to try to get changes to certain things.
Yeah, several cities will move from a straight, especially if you have a little bit larger site, is to do a PD zoning, planned development zoning, which steps out of a particular silo of a zoning and looks at a special condition and says, for the project that you're proposing on this site, we like all of that, but you need to make these adjustments. You might have a lower parking ratio, might have a higher height, whatever it is relative to what the existing zoning is, you kind of craft a new one with the planning department, the city, around accomplishing your project and that is conforming zoning because you create a new zoning for it.
Yeah, in those
Is
cases.
that permanent?
In those cases, I'll say that's almost like creating,
Project-specific.
it's almost like creating another specific plan. It's also often called a master plan because it is almost like creating another specific plan just for that site because it is such a large area. So yeah, in that case, you are actually amending the zoning code to create a new zoning.
So then, let's say 20 years later, this thing is aging and someone wants to knock it down. Do they have to start over? Or is that zone, has that zoning been changed permanently?
Well, zoning is never permanent. You can always amend it.
A lot of cities, and I'll point to San Jose, almost everything you do now, regardless of the existing zoning, is a PD zoning, because it never falls in their silo anymore, and they get more discretionary control over the project when they create that, because they're crafting the zoning with you.
And then before Waldeck goes, people can also apply for like a variance or some other exception to certain things. So maybe they don't need a density bonus, but they say, oh, you know, I need to, you said to build it X way, but I need to build it Y way. I need to apply for a variance. Usually variance is a variance to vary from like a numerical requirement of some kind. An exception might be to say, well, you say that, you know, it's supposed to have a roof deck, but, you know, this place is on the side of a mountain or something, and it's really something, and so therefore I want an exception from having to do that. So there are ways to kind of say, yeah, you said to do this, but I need to get an exception. That might be appropriate for a smaller size project. Waldeck, and then Gail, and then really that's the last thing.
Since fairness is high on my agenda, my original question was about, you know, how we make sure that we are kind of densifying not only the area that we are working on, but also, you know, basically throughout the city kind of evenly. But I would like to also understand how this thing gets also done from the state point of view. Like, you know, we got this list, you know, this city is behind so much, this city is behind so much. Where is this coming from? Like, who decides that and why?
I will actually literally have a slide, 2 slides from now about that, so I will answer that in 1 second. And then Gail?
Yes, just a point of information. The vast majority of affordable housing projects in this town over the last 35 years have been in planned development zones. And those trade-offs were necessary to create the affordable housing complexes that we have and many people benefit from. And I'm not sure how many people are aware of that. I think it is useful to think of it as a tool that can achieve other social and housing goals.
And just one more thing. The affordable housing that has been built in Palo Alto is deed restricted for 55 years. So it remains affordable housing for 55 years.
Great. Let's give Diane a hand. Thank her for being here. You're welcome to stay. You're free to leave as well. We thank you so much for the work that you do and for coming and sharing your time with us and your knowledge and wisdom. So we might call you again as we keep developing the plan. So we really appreciate you. Last few things. This slide is just kind of listing some of the areas. If you do want to do some Googling or looking at our policies, we have development standards and requirements. So Diane was talking about, you know, parking or different requirements, open space that might be imposed onto a project. And so by changing development standards, we can affect the affordability of a project. Housing impact fees, so we talked about housing impact fees or in lieu fees being paid when a developer is building if they're not building their inclusionary units. We have our inclusionary housing program, which we just spoke to, and we also have our housing element. So the housing element is one of the required 7 mandatory parts of the general plan, the comprehensive plan, and it's mandated to be updated either every 5 years or every 8 years. And it is where we find the requirements that, well, like that you were just kind of wondering, where do those come from? So the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, determines the total number of homes that the Bay Area needs to build. And it determines how affordable the homes need to be in order to meet the housing needs of all income levels. So the 2015 to 2023 RHNA, so that's the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, for Palo Alto is 1,988 units. That's 3.4% of the Santa Clara County total. So again, so they get HCD kind of says, okay, Bay Area, specifically ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, this is how much housing you guys need in your region. ABAG works together to allocate that out to different jurisdictions, and they give us a number. 1988 is our number. There's a new cycle coming up, 2022 to 2030, and that will give us new numbers. So right now there's a committee that's working on the methodology that will kind of work through all these things. There are multiple factors, basically a big effort in demography, looking at trends of like who's moving to the Bay Area and where, and job growth and all these things to project out kind of what that growth will look like. So you can find out there's a lot more detail that you can find out, but that's kind of a high level of where those numbers come from. I see your head scratching maybe, or wheels turning.
What is the base of that 1,900 unit? Is it based on number of residents currently in the city, the land, the number of workplaces? It's like,
It's based, so it's kind of, so demographers, are trying to look at trends around growth. And so job growth, people growth, population growth, birth, deaths, immigration, outmigration, all these things, all these factors. I think there's about 50 different factors or so that go into the RHNA numbers that lead to kind of, this is how we see the region growing. And then the RHNA, the ABAG has to look kind of across the region specifically of how to allocate that growth based on those factors as well. You want to say something, Doria? Because you have years of working with this, and
so HCD is the state housing, and they take recommendations from ABAG in MTC in our area, and that is based on a mathematical model, and it's actually based on jobs growth, and it's based on jobs growth per national trends of the growth of the kind of jobs you have the most of in the Bay Area. So it's based on the fact that tech is growing in other parts of the country, and we have mostly a predominance of tech jobs. So our housing is based specifically on a regional basis on that. And so the places that already have more jobs, this is my understanding, the places that already have a lot of tech jobs are going to get more tech jobs because tech nationwide is growing. So that's my understanding of how it works. And it's also MTC ABAG. MTC is Metropolitan Transportation Agency, and they just merged with ABAG, which is Association of Bay Area Governments. And those are not elected officials, just so you know. So it's kind of made up of people from various agencies and elected, but they are not elected to those jobs. So it's kind of a mysterious process a little bit.
I believe that there are folks who sit on ABAG and MTC who are from local governments, but it's not elected. It's not elected.
They're not elected to MTC, ABAG.
Yeah, they're members of local governments, like your mayor or your council person from XYZ area would then go up to.
They're assigned other elected officials and representatives, agencies that are assigned there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it works.
So it's heating up now, so we can keep you guys informed of it. It's interesting. I mean, it's very nerdy to some degree. I mean, it's very important to us, but the details of the methodology get kind of weedy. I see Terry and then Angela.
Okay, real quick comments. I've been involved very deeply in the ABAG issue. The methodology, I got to be honest with all of you, is flawed, tremendously flawed, because it is based on a jobs-based model. It's not based on what I consider to be a jobs-housing balance. What we need in this community is a more jobs-based housing model that balances housing with jobs. We do not have that model. The model that they've created is basically a model geared toward one thing, adding more jobs, because in all frankness, the state earns more money by bringing in more jobs. That's how they're making a lot of their money. That's how Sacramento is their budget is tremendous, is because they want more jobs, and they want more jobs even in this area. So the problem is that ABAG is their vehicle, ABAG and MTC is their vehicle for launching this model and enforcing it to the Bay Area. We need to fight back, and I mean that honestly to all people, that ABAG and MTC truly represent the communities that are most affected, especially those here in the West Bay.
Okay,
So
Terry, I
that
just
there is
wanna
a jobs
wrap up
housing
so we can-
balance.
we
It's
move on.
very important.
No, it is very important. I just know it's not going to be something we can do through the NV cap. So this is, again, just kind of giving people a background of where these things come from so we have some sense of that. So the last thing I'll say on this, when we talk about our housing element and the 354 units that are totally assigned within the NV cap area, that number has come up. That's saying that when we do our housing elements, we get this number, we as a city have to then allocate that number across the city to say, well, where would those 1988 units go? And so we have to say, well, here are these parcels that, if someone chose to build, according to our zoning code, they could build 1,988 units. And then that's where we get the number 354. So within the NV cap area, we in our housing element have said on these parcels, if they became housing, this is how much housing could be yielded there. And that adds up to our 1988, right? We have to actually say where could our RENA allocation be distributed. We're not saying it's going to be built, but that's where it could be. And so the RENA cycle is coming up, and we'll also have to redo our housing element. So we have to then, again, get our new number and then allocate that around to the city. And then there's only, I believe, 2 cycles. So again, these 2 housing element cycles, every 5 to 8 years you have to redo it. You can only use your sites 2 cycles. Basically, the state's saying, hey, look, if in 2 cycles you said that, yeah, somebody could build housing here, but no one's building housing here, then either you've got to change your zoning so people build housing, or you've got to find another site to say you're going to allocate it, because just because theoretically it's going to be there, it's not meeting the needs of the people to keep up with the population growth. Angela, last question, and we're going to move on to transportation.
Okay, thank you. Mine's a 2-part question. Sorry. Okay. So I'm really curious about the affordability requirements and meeting the needs of all income levels. How does that happen if, for instance, you're living in a situation or you're living in a city where it's really, really expensive to build? I mean, how is it determined? Where it doesn't pencil. And, I mean, going along with that and what you were talking about, what happens if you don't do it, or if the property owners don't want to do it? What happens if we don't meet those?
Yeah, so the first question is how does it meet all needs? And so the RENA is that 1988 units is broken up into 4 income groups. Very low, it's extremely low, very low, moderate, and then above moderate. So there's 4 income groups that it's broken into. And so then you can see, so the numbers allocated across those different units. As of 2018, which is halfway through our cycle, we were halfway through meeting our moderate, or above moderate, right? So if we continued on the same path, we would meet our above moderate. We were not meeting even close to halfway the other categories, right? And so I think that's where I would say, Terry, even if the methodology is flawed, we are underbuilding affordable housing for people in the community, right? So it's whether the number is 1988 or some other number, we're not building enough housing for people who need housing to be able to be affordable to them. And then so what do we do? Like, what happens if things keep going the way that they're going, right? And we keep not meeting it, eventually what happens? That's a question I think the state is tackling, and I think the question for us as NVCAP to tackle and the city council to tackle. How do we make sure that we can maintain our local zoning and influence over how we want our community to be in the future if we continue to not meet this? There could be more and more state regulations that impose certain things. There could be lawsuits. I think, was it Huntington Beach that got sued, or Seal Beach, one of the beach cities that the governor said, go ahead and sue these guys because they don't want to comply. with what HDD is saying. I mean, we're not doing that, right? We're not kind of just saying, oh, we're not going to do it. But, you know, I don't want to say what could happen because I don't know, but those are some things. I don't know if you guys have seen other things happen in other cities that are not meeting their arena over and over, but yeah, they kind of take the cake for that. Yeah.
Huntington Beach was the biggest example of, they got sued by the state. I think other than that, the big thing is that they don't qualify for a lot of funding. They get a lot of funding withheld if they don't meet their numbers.
So there you go. No, the funding gets withheld if you don't meet your numbers. Okay, I'm going to stand up and stretch, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to what Alan has to say. So I invite you to stand up and stretch. I know we're at 7:25, so we've been sitting for a long time. But we have more wonderful information about transportation that Alan is going to impart to us. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And okay, great. So just switching gears a little bit here is starting to talk about transportation, and this is an opportunity to discuss further the idea of the multimodal transportation management options. So many of you might be familiar with the idea of complete streets. Basically, it's the idea that there's room on a street for everybody who wants to be there, and in a mobile sense, walkers, bikers, transit, and improved vehicle flow of vehicles. So the idea of a complete street is a fairly new one. It's not just auto-centric anymore. It's actually got accommodations for all modes. And then what you get from that is, you know, you get benefits to traffic flow, you get community health and vitality, and a higher level of sustainability. So you might be familiar with walk scores, the idea of a kind of a measurement system, if you will, with regards to a national guide to the walkability of a neighborhood. Palo Alto's numbers are on the left in general, so it's got a very good walk score in general. These are all out of 100, by the way. Transit score, there is transit present, but perhaps a little lower, and then the bike scores are fairly high. Now to the right are the NV cap area specific scores. So you can see that it's determined to be very walkable. There's a higher level of transit, and then it's a biker's paradise at 100%. So so jumping into the idea of the existing conditions memo and analysis by Perkins and Will, some very in-depth reporting in that document, and it was very helpful to understand a little bit better about what we're dealing with the existing conditions. There's a on-street and off-street capacity that exists, 500 on-street, 2,400 off-street, and what we're finding is the utilization rates of those existing spots are not 100% utilized. There's actually capacity available. So, the results basically are that there's a significant level of spare on and off-street parking spots within the NV cap area. And that's good news. So obviously with increased development or higher densities, that will change, but as it stands today, there's actually an abundance of parking. So parking costs, it's not free. There's construction, maintenance, security, all the costs that's involved. You'll see between $5,000 and $10,000 costs for surface spaces, $25,000 to $50,000 a stall for structured spaces. And what's really interesting about that quote there is that the last sentence is, and while it's expensive to build, the actual users of these parking spaces are seldom charged a price for using them. So free parking's kind of a bad idea, and it has been for a long time. It incentivizes driving, basically. And thus, it's kind of like if you build it, they'll come. So the higher costs of parking are incorporated into all kinds of things: taxes, rents, mortgages, lease, land costs, building costs, and the cost of the goods and services. And parking takes up a lot of space that's used for storing vehicles, not for higher, better uses. And so basically, even if you don't pay directly, you still pay. So there's a number of policies in the city, just to kind of a recap, but that's in the Muni Code, there's where you can find the parking. 1852, parking's based on the zoning and the use of the lot in general. Some areas may have special requirements due to certain parking needs. Developers can ask for exceptions, as Rachel mentioned. And there is flexibility to the existing parking standards that can be gained through this process right here, the specific area planning process. So there's a couple of strategies that are worth considering. The idea of joint use parking strategies. So you've got a pool of parking areas that's available to multiple tenants, not just individual users. And that can really help because sometimes you'll find that like nightclubs have different needs for parking than offices, day use versus night use, et cetera. So those parking spaces can be shared economically. You also have the idea of the 1-to-1 ratio rather than having one space per housing unit or promoting the idea of one per housing unit rather than one per bedroom can help to reduce a parking requirement in an area. And that has to do with the idea I'll touch on the next slide is of establishing maximum parking rather than minimum parking requirements. Also, an interesting thing that just happened down in San Diego is that the city eliminated parking requirements in areas which were a half mile from transit stops. Now, they're denser than Palo Alto is, but that saves $90,000 per unit in those areas, housing units, which is significant. So they are experimenting with that, and they'll be watched closely with how that goes. There's also something called the city lifts or puzzle lifts. Those are really innovative stacked parking concepts. They're established systems. There's a company based in Oakland that focuses on those, and they've reduced the parking requirement by 40 to 60%. I mean, it's a significant savings in space. You can also wrap street level parking with retail or structured parking basically with retail. And that not only energizes the streets and maximizes the tax base, but it also provides the needed parking in an area, obviously. So the idea of a parking maximum versus minimums, a lot of cities are going towards establishing maximum parkings, and that basically says one parking spot per unit, not 1.5 per unit. Which is a minimum. So that can create smaller, reduced parking areas of the physical size of the lot, and it promotes compact developments, and it also helps in stormwater runoff and GHG emissions. Parking maximums for overall district could be something to be considered. This is a 60-acre planning area, so it could be looked at as a whole rather than for individual uses, and that could yield a net result way less than what would be required as a minimum parking for each individual use in that area.
But one problem with this is if you do underpark and the people really do have two per apartment, then that spills out into the neighborhoods nearby. And that happened to us. There's a development near us that was underparked.
Mm-hmm.
And they park on our streets now. So, it sounds very nice, and the numbers for parking spots, they are very expensive.
Yeah.
It does not seem logical. But just simply reducing the number of parking on site doesn't solve the problem. It just kind of pushes it elsewhere.
Sure, that's understood. The good news is within the area currently, there's 63% utilization of on-street parking during working hours. So that's not 100%, but that's good news. Yeah. And also, with regards to the off-street spaces, that there's only 41% utilization of the 2,400 spaces that are available in that zone.
Because we had a tenant that didn't have any customers.
Honestly, I mean,
okay.
The problem is that people are renting those places, and then they are not renting. It doesn't matter a thing. I have in front of me parking that has about, 50 parking spaces. It's empty, right? We cannot use it because it's private. So as long as we're going to keep that separation, which I believe it's artificial, and also if we're going to create a large commercial zone versus residential zones, we're going to have empty parking lots in commercials during the night and empty in residential during the day.
Yeah, and there are solutions around that have been used. For instance, like parking districts for a particular development area where residents could gain a sticker, for instance, to access those parking lots after hours. There's a lot of compromise, I think, in that, and obviously the idea of efficiently using the parking that exists and the new parking that comes online, it benefits everybody.
I went to a presentation about parking, especially around transit districts, and one of the innovative things was that if you signed a development, if you were leasing an office or building an office building, and you said, okay, you can use this at night, you got a benefit from the city on the number of units of office space that you could build, because they knew that, and this is Concord, which is not built out. It does still have green fields in Concord, but it allowed them to think of the parking 24 hours a day rather than 8-hour blocks.
Great, great. Makes a lot of sense, yeah. Transit overlay zones are also something that's common practice, and that has to do with rezoning the parking requirements within a half-mile of a transit zone, like the Caltrain station. And so there are reduced parking requirements within those zones, knowing that there are robust transit options available. And there's been some success and some examples and precedents set for that all around the country. So it's something that could be addressed as well or entertained. Yes, Gail?
Have you referenced the green parking standards? Do you know what I'm talking about, right?
No, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't have the right phraseology, but there is a nonprofit that's working, either Transform or Spur, I forget which one, where they have a whole series of scenarios related to reduction of parking to meet greenhouse gas emission standards. So it's a sustainability model. They have an online kind of calculator. You can determine, and developers use these calculations in planning out elements of various complexes.
Oh, that's terrific.
But I think it is, I'll get the proper name, but it is being used certainly by the development community and cities. Some cities have adopted this as part of their zoning code.
Great, thank you, Gail.
So
That's
I'll
it
get the
sounds like
name so I can be more specific.
Thank you. Sounds like a tremendous resource. Those, there's a lot of good work being done out there. So, did you have a question, Waldeck? No. No. Or, okay.
I do. Well, maybe comment to our future thinking is that more and more people I see using all those different electrical ways of transportation. I don't know how to refer to them, right? Scooters and stuff like that. And this is this last mile kind of a thing, connection to the train station. And I wonder if we shouldn't think about it when we're going to be thinking of planning our area, is to provide the ways, because right now they are half danger, right? They go either on the street between the cars, or they're going on the walkways, which then they are danger to pedestrians. So should we think about this thing as a part of the solution?
Transit storage can be an issue.
That's true. Well, they can use bike lanes, and they're set up for that currently. They'd have to negotiate with cyclists, but that's a logical place for them to use, and they should be wearing their helmets too, by the way. They don't do that very often. So there's some basics on transportation demand management. These are some proven practices. So just hitting on the high points here, but the idea of a political leader or institution that becomes a strong champion is key to these. There's pricing and incentives, the kind of the carrot and the stick concept of incentivizing people. TDM is basically the idea of how do we minimize vehicle trips and somehow get people out of their vehicles to get around. And so these are incentives, and so again, carrots and sticks to incentivize that, mostly incentives though. So the idea of, parking rates, there's transit programs, free, like if you work in a downtown area, it's not uncommon to get a free bus pass through your employer. There's parking pricing and management. There's cost recovery with regards to parking, actually paying the legitimate costs that goes towards the funding of these stalls. The building of them, that is. And then, unbundling parking from tenant leases and purchases is always an interesting thing to do. Thus, that $90,000 savings without, so if, parking can be accommodated for in another way than being tied to the lease or the sale of a condo or, a home, in a urban area can be really beneficial. So then there's some development practices and processes that are worth understanding. So it's kind of the idea like that there would be a bold strategy with regards to major developments to say, look, you need to provide TDM in this development because of the amount of people. So there might be some threshold there that says, look, you'll have an expedited review process if you meet these TDM requirements, that kind of thing, and that can really help. And then the idea of trip planning and decision making. There's a lot of apps out there for that now, and it's become easier and easier actually with even Uber and things like that we can call up over our phone. So I just want to introduce you and wrap up with this concept. This is an international transportation-oriented design standard. This is not unlike the green building standard for LEED. There's a rating system there on the right side. That's a gold, bronze, and silver ratings. So there's 8 core principles to these inclusive TOD standards. They're assessment tools that are used to score urban development plans, and it's a recognition system. It's it can really sell a project, for instance, and brand it with saying, my project's got gold ratings. And what's really important about this sequence here is this is an international transportation-oriented design standard. So you'll see this, there's a bunch of Cal Berkeley folks that are involved with this. But what's really interesting about this is that these concepts, you'll see, reinforce everything that Della and Rachel had been saying, and Annie and Rachel from Perkins and Will. These concepts are this area. This NVCAP area is a TOD. So principle 1 is the idea of walking. Develop neighborhoods that promote walking. I'll leave these so you can have a look, but there's objectives and ways to measure what these standards are. It's really helpful. And there's a point system, actually, when you really dig into the details of the system. And so cities, should they choose to go for a rating, they say, we got a TOD, we want to get a certification. There's a whole series of points that are associated with each of these objectives. How well do you meet them? Cycle, prioritize non-motorized transportation networks. And this is principle number 2. 3 is connect, create dense networks of streets and paths. Principle 4 is transit, locate development near high-quality public transit. 5 is plan for mixed uses, mixed incomes, and mixed demographics. 6 is densify, optimize density and match transit capacity. 7 is be compact, create regions with short transit commutes. And 8 is shift, increase mobility by regulating parking and road use. So what's interesting here is that even though this is kind of an international standard, all those concepts apply right here in NBCAP, which is really interesting. So that's what I'll close out with, and if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Questions or comment about transportation, Keith?
Follow up talking about the parking again. We have a big incentive if you can shrink the parking that's required on a development, because that reduces a lot of costs. But if that's just shifted to the street, then you haven't gained anything. Do you know of any cities that have charged for street parking in residential areas? And has that worked out?
Well, I can say I live in San Francisco, and you need a permit to park in most areas in the city. It's a monthly pass.
And how much is that monthly pass?
It's expensive. It's not cheap. You pay, I think, as a resident, you have to prove your residency, and then it's about $150 a month, I'd say. And it's a sticker on the back of your car, and then you're allowed to park in certain zones. And the zones that, the city's well mapped out, and the zone nearest to your house is the sticker you get. So even though you pay that fee, you can't park down 3 blocks away or some other zone. You're parking in that zone.
And if your zone is full, then?
Hey, good luck. Take that Uber.
Can you find places to park usually, or?
I personally, yes. I'm out in the Richmond district, so it's by Golden Gate Park, and it turns over pretty good out there, and there's some eased restrictions on the parking. But downtown, it's a totally different ballgame. But the other thing I just want to touch on, the idea of reducing the parking, what makes sense here is that it's in a TOD area. There's robust transit available. So it's not just a parking minimum that says, look, you have to hit these numbers and create these big pools of parking, it's saying you're going to get a break in this area because we know that some trips will be done in transit. So it's common practice.
Have you guys looked at this at all, and has it panned out? It almost seems like world peace. Oh yeah, we'll just have one car per unit, and we'll take Uber everywhere else. But do people actually do that?
Well, I don't know where you put your car when you're Ubering if you have to find a street spot for it. So
Yeah.
that's one question. But I mean, there's a lot. I'm not an expert, but I've dealt with this a lot. One of the problems, and I don't know that TOD is a city designation. One of the problems is the inconsistency. So we have two forms of transit. In my opinion, calling it rich or robust is hopeful at best. We have Caltrain, and presently VTA operates buses on El Camino. We find every year that they reduce our buses, and they could reduce them at any time. So I am not aware of planners that really consider bus routes to be zoning tools because they are ephemeral. And they go basically the same places, and they don't go all the places that people need. So it's very, very hard. I have always been an advocate of actually shifting the burden of some of our neighborhood street parking onto big companies, not local merchants and whatnot, but the big companies that are allowed to, commuters that are allowed to buy permits under our residential parking permit programs. Because that seems to me, and because the Research Park, Google, they already operate a lot of private buses, and that seemed to be a better model in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and single occupancy vehicle trips for those big companies. And that's sort of consistent with state laws, I understand, for residential parking permit programs. And the local businesses that have more low-paid workers are the ones that would be accommodated. We haven't had much success that I can see with our TDM programs. We don't have reports on them that we can refer to show much success, except for the number of Go passes, or what are the other passes that are train and bus? I forget what they're called.
There's a Clipper
Well,
cards.
yeah, but there's one that's bus and Caltrain. But anyway, yeah, but anyhow, those they can give them away. Are people using them? I mean, I don't know how many people were able to come here today without a car, but the issue is also that I think, and you can speak to this, Tim, but I think that buildings and residential or commercial are more valuable if they can provide parking, because most people need to drive. And another problem is that even if you can take, this is what we've seen with studies, is that even if you can take public transportation or an alternate form to go to your fixed position every day, which is house, job, job, house, which is not how everybody's life is set up. Most people still have cars, like I said, unless they can't afford them, so that they can do other things like grocery shopping at Costco instead of walking to an expensive farmer markets, or taking their family to see relatives in Sacramento, or, the region is not rich with robust transportation options. So I think one of the best ideas presented realistically for us is shared parking for uses that are daytime uses and nighttime uses. And I also will remark that there may be buildings that are the biggest buildings, which is J. Paul and the Fry site. You may observed anecdotally that they were overparked, and I think the J. Paul building might be, but we're talking about redeveloping those. So I think we should think in terms of not what's there now, but when we redevelop, how much parking we're going to need too.
Tim, did you want to speak at all to any parking experience that you'd like to share? Or?
You're asking a developer who wants to speak.
What are your thoughts?
I was writing different notes on different things she touched on. I'm on the Mountain View TMA, which is a Transportation Management Association, which has Google, Intuit, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Samsung is all participating. I get to be the little widget, developer on the token. But what I'm learning a lot about, these are professional transportation gurus that deal with, 1,500 buses with Google and this, that, and trying to manage all these things. And part of the TMA's role is to provide and understand and provide ways to get people out of their cars. And I have all these very professional people around me. I'm learning by osmosis a little bit. Interesting, we just finished our budget for the next fiscal year, and the one thing, you look at where our dollars are effective and the most effective per person out of a car is carpool. Not a bus, not a private bus, not a public bus, not a train, nothing but, and it gets to your point, is a carpool. So our subsidies are now being increased for carpool and getting that word out and that system out to connect people to volunteer, drive in a van, and getting people there to carpool. And I just thought it was a revelation of all the things we've talked about and struggle with trying to figure out. It's you and me deciding we're going to drive to work tomorrow together is the most effective, cost-effective, and productive form of all the options that these professionals have to look to. And they have very strong, in the North Bay Shore area where Google and all these are located, very strong restrictions on trips and traffic, and also they're putting their best resources to it. And to come back with carpool being the most effective piece, I think is a really interesting data point to consider. The greedy developer doesn't want to spend any more money than necessary. Important. What is necessary? Necessary is market demand. What is the renter or the buyer or the renter of the office space or the residential space? What is it that they want and they're willing to pay for it? So we don't create the market in our head. We go to sources that do the data research on what is the market demand of where you park a car and how many cars you need before we decide to tell, because we have to convince that bank that that money that we're projecting in income is the security for them to loan me money. And they want me to prove to them that I can get and achieve that amount of money for the money they're going to lend me. So if I renege, they take property back, they have an income source. So it's very important for me to be able to tell them what the real market demand is. I do not want to spend $1 building one extra parking stall if the market won't pay for it. So when I come to you and I say, in that location, I can do 1.4 units or parking stalls, we've done our research, and have the city say, no, you can only have a half, is maybe getting ahead of itself in what your expectations. It's aspirational, but it's not been proven yet that area would get market support to build that kind of parking. However, in Palo Alto primarily, your parking ratios may be too heavy. And is one of the reasons why you're not getting more housing built, because the cost burden of providing the parking ratio that the city currently has, that we all generally have to follow, is a little heavier on what the current market demand is. So your comments about parking, I think having a maximum versus a minimum is the right kind of switch, as long as the maximum gives the developer enough room to really understand, if I'm going to ask that much rent, what is that renter really willing to pay that much rent for, right? If they don't have a car and they'll pay more rent than the guy that has a car, then I'll build it with no parking. But I have to understand the market, and I have to tell my lenders and my investors, my equity partners, and the city that I will have a successful project when I put that money into that project. So all these things are not static, or they are very dynamic, and they change. When I first got into building apartments, you had to have 2.5 parking stalls to be competitive per 2-bedroom unit and for a rental apartment. And now the average new projects are about 1.25 to 1.5 for a 2-bedroom. And we can support that in general. So Palo Alto's, yeah, I think you could get by with less than your, right now your 2-bedroom requirements, two parking stalls per plus guest parking, which is on top of that as an average number. So the burden for a two-bedroom for rental is different from ownership, but the rent parking ratio is a little higher than the area's kind of demands are. And that's affecting the cost of building.
Yeah, I'll say
That's a lot. I'm
I
sorry.
don't have the source at my fingertips, but I was going to say, and you just succinctly summed up what I was going to say, is you're correct. We, as overall planners, are not seeing that households are completely giving up their cars. What we are seeing is that households are reducing how many cars they have, though. Many households are not having one car per person anymore. They are more likely trending towards one car per household. So that's why a lot of cities are moving towards fewer parking per household, and they are successful in that model. So, and I think he just illustrated that point very nicely.
Great, Gail?
Yeah, I'm of the belief that we're in a transition phase right now. And so actually there are studies that look at, the age of the user or the age of the employee. And so if you look at that, I'm sure a lot of people in this room have friends, colleagues, or relatives who are younger than, let's say, younger than I am, which is pretty easy to do at this point. And they don't have cars, or they have, one per household, that kind of thing. And I think it's always difficult to determine, are we imposing our values and experience through the future when we're in a period of transition? And I think that's kind of one of the key issues. Do we have a social responsibility to address parking in a very different way because there are climate issues and there are greenhouse gas issues and that kind of thing? But last quick comment, the phrase I was looking for, I looked it up, Green Trip Certification. It's developed by the nonprofit Transform, and there are a lot of, organizations, cities, some cities, and the development community looking at that, and they're really focusing on the reduction of, auto use. And I think it is important. It's sort of analogous to some of the things you were talking about in TOD. But I think it's important to reference this and to consider this when we're looking at the overall plan. Last quick question. When you talked about the parking, not jig, it was puzzle. You're talking about vertical parking, right? Stacking?
Yeah, they're puzzle lists. Have you ever played the little thumb game with the one missing piece?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like that, but with cars, and it's pretty
But
slick.
are they vertical, yes?
Yes, and wide.
Yeah.
And there's one car missing, and they stack.
Oh, my God,
and
so it's a
you-
moving,
You punch a number in, my car's number
Got it.
8, and it comes
I got
back
it.
to you. And it's
see.
quite extraordinary
because
system.
I think Japan's quite advanced in that
Yeah,
kind
in,
of thing.
in fact, this company in Oakland has one that's 30 years old that they built in Japan, and
There
they
you
said
go.
it's gone flawless over the
Wow.
last 30 years. City Lift is the name of the company. City Lift is the
City
name.
Lift.
I think, yeah, it's, but the trade-off is that a 40% to 60% reduction in the amount of parking area you need. You have
So
to
you're
run-
using it more
You have to see if it
efficiently.
pencils out,
Yeah.
right? They're using it in San Leandro, in Oakland.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, a lot of, more urban development.
Okay, so we're winding down towards the end. Any last questions on transportation? Okay, hopefully we're still awake here. Okay, so now we're just gonna kind of bring it all together. So what makes for successful cities and neighborhoods? Now, this is obviously a somewhat subjective question. Depends on what you like in your city, what you like in your neighborhood, what's gonna make it successful. But a lot of what we think about are having, critical mass, which again, what is that critical mass of residents, workers, and visitors that are gonna allow you to have walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented place. We talked a lot about wanting to reduce car traffic and kind of, to the degree we can, get people out of their cars in this development area, which we know, we just kind of talked about, might not be no new cars, right? But how do we minimize cars through the area? How do we have the human scale and height and form? So when you think about, El Camino and big thoroughfares, buildings are often built at a large scale, so as people are driving by quickly in their cars, they can see the place and are enticed to stop. but that scale is not the human scale, right? Human scale is much smaller, much more fine grained. And so we want to have something that, again, that reinforces the desire to walk and bike, because it feels like you should be walking and biking. If you've ever been in a place that's not built for human scale, you kind of feel like, should I be walking here? You kind of feel like a little person out there in the wilderness, and you wonder, is this safe? So we want to have a scale of height and form that really promotes that walking and biking and has those people out of their cars. We want an inviting public realm. Again, it's a pleasurable place to be, to linger, to walk, to spend your time. And we want to have it be locally appropriate so that, again, the local community has places that they want to go, they want to eat, they want to shop, they want to spend time, and destinations. So we want to have, I think a critical thing for walking and biking is that you have places that people want to get to, right? That they can get there within walking or biking distance of their work, of their home, of maybe a place they visited. Maybe they're going to the library, or they're going to some other thing. They're going to this Creekside Park that we'll have. They're going to Bulwer Park, right? There's a destination that they want to get to, and they want to walk or bike to and from that destination. So these are big kind of ideas, but the point is that the transportation we talked about, the planning principles, the housing, the economics, all of this and more mixes together to help create these vibrant places. There's, of course, things we didn't touch on. I think schools is a great one. School planning in collaboration with these developments, thinking about how many children might these different developments yield, and there's demographic research you can do to figure out, given a development, given the unit size, given XYZ, how many children of school age might be yielded from those households. And thinking about that, our open space planning that we want to do and we take very seriously. All of these other parts are also part of what makes a successful neighborhood and city. Waldeck?
Can we just close that issue with the schools? Can city basically do analysis? Do we need extra school in Palo Alto or not? And because if we need it, we need it.
Yeah.
But if not, then we keep coming to that issue. Or maybe we can make
The answer
that.
to that question is not static, because I've lived here long enough that I went through the school closures where we sold off school sites, and now there's overcrowding. So it's not a static answer.
So Ventura is still not being used as a school, right?
It's not owned by the school district any longer.
It's split between the city and the school district, both co-own portions of that parcel.
My short answer to that question is, I think it'd be great for the city and the school district to collaborate. I'm not familiar enough with our relationship. I know it's very good relationship between the city and the school district. In some cities, the school district will do their own, because it's a separate entity and a separate governing body. They will do their own demographic research to say how many students they need in the location. On the other hand, cities also will, when new development areas, because this is a pretty sizable area, there's research that can be done to again, see what is the potential yield of students from a development of certain scale, so that there can be adequate planning for, a school. So it's kind of a both and collaboration, so I think we should definitely keep working with the school district on it. I just don't want to say, yes, we're going to do a study, because I don't know that I can make that commitment. But certainly needs to be studied and looked at, and we got to figure out how to make sure that it gets incorporated. Because it's certainly a good question to ask, right, and question to raise.
One of the first questions the school will say is, how many people are you adding to this area? And we'll say, we don't know. And
So once we know that, then we can start to think about how many of those people are kids, right? So we're a little bit before I think we can even ask the question of how many kids they're going to be, because we don't know
Depends on the unit size.
exactly all that. So once again it gets refined, we can do that. And then I think this graphic we included in your packet, but it's probably hard to see from a distance. But what's lovely about it is from the Project for Public Spaces, in the center kind of has these 4 qualities of what makes a place great: sociability, uses and activities, comfort and images, access and linkages. And then the second ring out has kind of things that are kind of like, you know it when you see it. Something's fun, it's active, it's vital. Those are hard words to maybe define just for one person. And then the outer ring has metrics, so ways that you could measure kind of those inner rings. So uses and activities, one way you could measure is like rental levels. If people are renting the bikes at a place, then people are using that activity. If people are having a lot of sales, then maybe there's a lot of use and activity going on. So again, it's a framework to kind of think about our plan area. And so I think, we have a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunity with the NVCAP. And our challenge and our opportunity is to say we have this area, we have these different types of planning levers we can pull and try to use in order to convey the public's interest in what we'd like to see in this area. And trying to work together with all the stakeholders, public, community, neighbors, people who live there, people who work there, people who are nearby there, to say, okay, if we do this housing, if we do this type of parking plan, if we do this open space requirement, if we do all these things, can it add up to a great place that also gets realized? And I feel like we're well on our way. I feel really positive. I hope that you guys feel positive too and keep staying in it. I know we have some consternation, but I think we are continuing to evolve our planning so that we can get to both the big picture, but also some of these specific questions answered. Doria, do you have something you were going to say?
I was really baffled by this graph.
Uh-huh.
Because the little dots on the side, which I think were like the key
Attributes,
Key attributes, intangibles, measurements.
Yeah, so
I think you should explain, I think the three rings aren't explained very well by
so that right. So what it was trying to show you, it was giving you an example of the red area. So if you look at the red is sociability, right? So the deepest red is the key attribute, sociability. Yeah, and then you're supposed to then attribute that same gradation to the other. Yeah, it was not very clear. Well, especially because the way it's located, it makes it seem it's like just kind of sitting there. It took me a while too. I thought, what are these red dots here? No, it's not the best key. It's not the best key that I've seen. So that's kind of how that radiates out.
I wanted to say, I thought this was one of the greatest, most complete resource packages I've ever seen, and it's answered so many and addressed so many issues I and others have brought up. When I really dove into it, I said, yes, and I've been sending copies of this to all my relatives, and, everything that are interested.
I sent it to my son.
So I think it's really, really good. And the links to the articles, I thought, oh my God, yes, of course, it's great. I just wanted to say something positive.
Well, we appreciate that, and thank you, Della and Alan, for your hard work on that. Thank you for those who waded through it. Sorry, it was a little bit much. Maybe got a little overzealous with the links, but it's there if you want to look at it.
It's great.
I'll say that for those of you that are really overzealous, some of those links are for websites that have just
even more
unlimited resources if you really want to get nerdy about planning. The American Planning Association or Plan Medicine or like some of those.
You do know we're volunteers, right?
I'm just saying if
Their
there's
volunteer
any
planning
subject,
degree.
we are absolute planning nerds. So I'm just saying if there's anything you're really into, they have unlimited
I've been a member
resources.
of a lot of those organizations, and you're right, they're really good.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
So also, we have actually two roles here to play, right? The one role is to actually go with this process and create that, whatever recommendation we're going to create. The second is actually to bring this thing back to our community, especially for us who live actually in the area, right? So that's why, those questions that I'm raising about the fairness and how the things are decided are important, maybe not for us as a group trying to make decisions or question this, but for us who are going back to our neighbors and basically explaining why we're going to end up with whatever 85 or 55 feet high buildings. So we need ammunition, basically, to be able to have those conversations with our neighbors.
I think, part of, well, maybe not ammunition, but information to provide to them, to persuade them. I think part of it is, well, in particular to the idea of, height or how are we being fair and equitable. I think those are really good questions. Those are questions that lots of communities struggle with when they say, okay, this is an area where we're going to put some housing, right? This is an area where we're going to redevelop, we're going to focus some energy. And then the question becomes, well, why not other areas? Why not other neighborhoods having similar activities? Now, part of it is, okay, well, you can't do everything at once. And there may be some perceptions or reality of unfairness. So we're going to put our housing burden here so that we can make sure that we build the housing that we're supposed to. Although we're not going to build, I don't think, 1,988 units, in this area. And so I think those are questions that we do need to keep raising as a community and think about how do we not try to, I think to Doria's kind of question a little bit, not solve everything here, right? What can we solve here? What can we do here that preserves the quality of life in this community now, but also for the future? And then also, kind of say, we should do here only what we'd be willing to do in other parts of Palo Alto, right? We should, do something that would be equitably distributed to other areas, maybe not just kind of rolled over other areas, but principles that we would see elsewhere. And at the same time, I think it is a bit of a stretch of trying to think about, here's our aspiration of where we want to get to in the future, and how do we have baby steps that get us there and are on the path. So I think to the point that Doria kind of was making around, well, maybe people might do 1-to-1 or 1.5 parking spaces per unit, but maybe not 0, right? We're maybe not in a place where you can really live a very easily life in Palo Alto without any car or any access to any vehicle, right? It's just not, the rest of the city's not set up for that, right? Even if your neighborhood was great for it, you might want to go somewhere else from every now and then, right? And so we're kind of straddling that. How do we live into the future, but also, have places that can be successful in the present? And so we want to hopefully have this be a foundation of, here are some principles we're thinking about and like the best goal, and we may not get all the way there, but where can we get where we can really be comfortable and where neighbors can feel that both supported, heard, and that they could live, with this if it were to come to fruition.
I think the biggest difference, though, I hear what you're saying, is the proximity to fixed rail here is not like what you're gonna find at the corner of, I don't know, somewhere else, off of El Camino, until we get bus rapid transit going or something like that. But the point is that the uniqueness of this defines challenge and opportunity, is
Right.
my basic point.
So take advantage of the assets that are here that may not be everywhere, right? Yeah, that's for sure.
I think.
Okay, so we're at 8:10. We're gonna head into the closing public comment if there's any public comment cards, but I wanna give
Can
a
I
chance
say
for everybody else.
something?
Yeah, before we do that, I wanna just give a chance for folks to make comments or questions before we head to the closing public comment.
I've lost my cell phone, and my number is 387-3329. If it might be here or in the parking lot. I had it when I was.
I'll just call you.
Okay, so.
387.
I've got her already
Okay.
on my. It's calling you right in.
Leave it with the food?
I went in there.
Yeah, but, yeah.
Thank you.
Isn't there a location thing on these?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it might be, but.
You have to have the phone. No, but can't you?
You have to have a computer or something, if
Computer.
something, it's something that's
Yeah,
like
okay.
connected to it.
Another device that knows
Yeah.
that.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
it's kind of a
right.
flaw in the
Those stuff
system,
is-
right?
Yeah.
I lost my phone, but I need my computer to find it, like.
It's probably in the car.
Probably. I did go down to check it at the beginning.
Oh,
I'm
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's not in the bathroom or someplace.
I didn't go to the bathroom. But maybe it went by itself.
Computer,
No.
computer, yeah.
It is a smartphone.
Are we,
owner, you know.
where are we in the CEQA process for this project with regards specifically to the historical resources and just in general? I kind of.
Yeah, so CEQA would begin, we would, once we have the plan and we present it to city council, we would begin the scoping process for our CEQA, environmental review. And so, to use an extreme example, were we to propose and the council were to, approve a plan that proposed to demolish the historic resource, let's say, or even significantly change it, that itself would have to be subject to CEQA review and would come back before the city council once the review is done. So we come up with our plan. We have to have that plan go through the CEQA review process, the environmental review process, and the council would have to adopt the plan and the environmental document at the same time that accompanies that plan.
So we don't need the review of the historic resources before we start deciding what we think is best in terms of.
When you say review of it, what do you mean?
Well, a structural review for one thing. If we have choices where we're retaining all of it, we're retaining a little section of it, or completely, don't we need to know what structurally we can do? I'm just asking.
Well, yeah, I think in the scenario of an adaptive reuse, I think we would need to work very closely with the Sobrato organization and really work to see if, what would that adaptive reuse scenario look like and what would need to happen. I don't know that would necessarily, because CEQA really, and I'm not a CEQA expert, so dangerous territory I'm wading into here. But maybe let's use another example, trip generation, that would be part of CEQA, or VMT, which they're switching to. So, whatever plan we look at, whatever we propose, there'll be vehicle miles generated from that, and there may be mitigation that's required from CEQA. With the historic resource specifically, I don't know that we would need to do further environmental analysis, but there may be other questions we need to answer in order for us to continue our planning, which sounds maybe more like what you might be suggesting. Yeah. Yeah, so I think we would probably need to know more about the building if we were going to propose crazy things to it, or even not crazy things, just retaining it. What does that look like?
Sorry. So do we need to keep CEQA in mind as we are making our decisions or coming up with? Do we need to keep CEQA possibilities in mind as we
I
make
would say
decisions?
yes and no. I would leave that mostly to some of our experts who we have, like our transportation experts. Especially transportation is going to be a big thing. When you add more people, you add more trips, you add more vehicle miles traveled. And so what does CEQA do? So CEQA, again, looks at what are the environmental impacts of a proposed project or plan, right? And then it tries to mitigate the negative impacts of those impacts, right? So it's disclosing the impacts, and then it's trying to mitigate for those impacts. And then it's saying to the decision-making body, here are the disclosure of the impacts, here are the ways that those impacts could be mitigated, and then the decision-making body, the city council, is saying, yep, that looks good, or nope, or whatever they want to say, or it needs more study, and we need to figure this out more, we need to dial this in a little bit more. Basically saying, if you are going to do X, you're going to have Y result, and in order to mitigate, you need to do, C. And so it's not stopping anything, it's not approving anything, so that's where we want to be cognizant that it has to go through that process, but the things that we decide, there will be disclosures that happen, and by disclosure, I mean disclosing the impacts from the things that we decide. Does that make sense?
Well, what it implies to me is that we should keep in mind that if we propose things that are going to have negative impact, we might want to think about some mitigating things that we could do to mitigate those negative impacts.
And to know that,
and keep those in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where our transportation folks can help us, because they have experience in saying, well, this is going to lead to this, and so we might want to counter it by doing this other thing. So that's kind of why I, suggested that. Yes, ma'am.
In the modified funding, have we maintained the integrity of a robust, intense environmental analysis?
Yeah, the environmental review is not touched in that reduction, because we need that. Any other comments or questions? Okay, Chicho, do we have any public commenters for this evening?
Yes, we have one more. Karen Holman.
Great, thank you.
The challenge here is going to be if I can read my own writing. So, scribbling down things, and to Rachel, I can appreciate how you want to maintain decorum. I was trying to ask a question of Diane when she was here.
So sorry.
And so we did speak out here, and hopefully I can take just a minute maybe to explain what happened. I was wanting to ask her a question because I thought she'd either misunderstood the question that I think Doria had asked. Palo Alto Housing has several projects that are adaptive reuse. And she confirmed that when we spoke out here. She thought the question was about converting, I'll make something up, like I don't know why filling station comes to mind, that's an absurd example, but converting a filling station to housing. They don't do that. However, and it is affordable for them to do those conversions of housing to housing. And the property with the buildings on it and stuff can be sold at somewhat a reduced rate, and that gives a tax credit to the property owner. So it actually is more affordable, or at least I was told in the past that it was more affordable than to build new. Having to do with adaptive reuse, if there was, and I just gave the example that I made up of, like, there's a 20,000 square foot building that exists in Ventura now, and it's going to be reused for something else, but a part of that requires that affordable housing be a part of that. Would you participate in that converted use? And she said, absolutely. She said she would send you email clarifying that, and she apologized for the misunderstanding, but I was trying to, and I understand, but anyway, hopefully that helps. CEQA, to Doria's question, which I do have in my notes, that was Doria's question. CEQA, whether it is traffic, air quality, historic resources, all reasonable and feasible alternatives have to be explored before a significant impact is perpetuated onto whether it's air quality or an intersection or a resource. So from my perspective, without looking at a structural analysis for the Fry's building to see what could happen there, it's a waste of a lot of time not to have that as an alternative, because when CEQA comes along, you're going to have to look at all reasonable and feasible alternatives. So you're going to have to go back and do all of that analysis. So what could happen? What could that building be used for? Is it structurally capable of doing X, Y, and Z? CEQA's going to require it. I didn't hear much about placemaking, which I was hoping to hear about. Added values for property. It's not all just dollars and cents when it comes to square footage and stuff, as I tried to say earlier. It's also like, what are the uses there? Is it art and culture? Is it, are there a lot of trees? A lot of trees can actually increase the value of resale of units or sales of units, and commercial use. A well-landscaped area is really valuable. When it comes to parking, when I moved to Palo Alto, it was like Menlo Park in that you couldn't park on the streets overnight. And I haven't ever bothered to look back and see when or why that changed. But from my perspective, when Palo Alto is willing to go back to that, is when we can look at reducing the parking ratios. And the market will tell us what, is required and what isn't required, and that's where Tim comes into play. Since I got to do Diane's correction, can I have just a minute more?
Yeah.
Tim's, invaluable. You'll tell us that. But what Keith said about then if something is underparked, then it spills over into the neighborhood. Well, that's really not really one development then imposes its impact onto neighbors. And the other thing is that it really, really changes the character of the neighborhood to have all these cars parked on the street. The neighborhoods in Palo Alto changed considerably. There are also trade-offs when it comes to parking. Other cities, and I've never been able to be successful with this at Palo Alto, but other cities require people who have an excessive parking, entities that have excessive parking, to provide that parking to other entities as well. It isn't always incentivized. Sometimes it is required. Don't know why we can't do that. And CEQA isn't, back to CEQA just for a moment, CEQA isn't the property owner, and this isn't about Sobrato or Tim or anything else. This is just CEQA. It isn't like what the owner does or doesn't want to do. It's CEQA, so it's environmental law and has to be satisfied. I will leave it at that, but
Great.
thank you all.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, seeing no other comment, thank you all for your attendance this evening and participation, and we'll see you back in this room. Oh,
I do have a question.
yes.
So the next meeting is the third Tuesday. 21st. The rest of the meetings this year are the fourth Tuesday, which lands on top of my Parks and Rec.
Yes, which is regrettable. We worked really hard to find when this room was available, which we compete with the Policy and Services and the Finance Committee and then the Rail Committee, among other committees. So I want to try to see if we can figure out something else, but that's what we did a lot. We looked really, really hard, and I really apologize for that. We even looked and see if the chamber was available, because that also has the video capabilities, and it's just very, very tight. So I want to work to see what we can do to make sure that we don't lose your participation to the degree that we can.
My Parks and Rec starts at 7, so at least I would get the first
Portion of it. Okay, great.
We keep having all these community benefits as offsets for additional, maybe one of these rooms should be.
Another community room, yeah, right, with video. All right, thank you all again. Have a good night.